A 737 is in trouble. The pilots blinded by rain. In the cabin, government officials and influential businessmen. The crash of IFO-21 shocks the world. Did a final act of war bring the plane down? The White House demands answers. This was no ordinary flight, but a military jet carrying American politicians. When the investigation is over, the Air Force itself is held responsible. Wednesday, April the 3rd, 1996. A raw spring day near the city of Dubrovnik, Croatia. Rain pelts the runway at the city's airport. A small group of diplomats hurry through the storm, trying to keep dry. They're part of a delegation that's just touched down. Among them, the Croatian Prime Minister and the American ambassador to the region, Peter Galbraith.
The flight into Dubrovnik was a scary flight. We couldn't see anything at all. At that point, I'd been ambassador to Croatia for nearly 3 years, and I'd done a lot of shuttle diplomacy, and it certainly was one of the most uncomfortable.
The weather that made Galbraith's landing so bad isn't letting up. In fact, commercial flights into Dubrovnik have been cancelled. But the ambassador and the others aren't waiting for a commercial flight. They're here to greet IFO-21, a US Air Force jet on a delicate mission. The plane is a specially designed 737. The Air Force has a small fleet of these jets to transport high-profile guests around the world. The cabin has everything needed to do business and politics 10,000 meters in the sky. Today, the cabin is filled with what the military call DVs, Distinguished Visitors. This group is led by United States Secretary of Commerce, Ron Brown.
Ron Brown was a very smooth, capable individual. He was a Washington insider. And he had all the skills that go with that.
Brown is a star in the Democratic Party.
I obviously will do everything that is possible.
He played an important role in getting Bill Clinton elected president. Under Clinton, Brown was appointed the first African-American Commerce Secretary in the country's history.
The United States companies that are here today are eager to engage in dialogue with government and business leaders, and more importantly, to do business.
Today, that job has taken Brown to one of the most troubled areas in the world. For 4 years, civil war ripped Bosnia and Croatia apart. But just a few months ago, an uneasy peace began. As Commerce Secretary, Brown is helping to rebuild the local economy.
The ambassador thinks we should.
The philosophy behind it was that the peace would not be durable unless there was economic progress in the region, that was really critical to the peace.
Brown's 3-day tour started that morning in Tuzla, Bosnia, where the group toured an electrical plant and ate hamburgers with American troops stationed there.
Being a former Army man myself, I know what being away from home is like, so we thought we would bring a little bit of home to you.
The final stop on today's tour is the ancient coastal city of Dubrovnik. Before the war, it was a vital part of the country's tourism industry.
It was my idea that Ron Brown should go to Dubrovnik. The Croatians were very eager to get the word out that Dubrovnik was still standing and that it was still a tourist destination. So I thought it would be very useful to have Ron Brown and the delegation go there.
But on this damp day, Dubrovnik is not at its best, or even visible. Fog presses down from the sky, obscuring the city and the beautiful Adriatic coast. To the north of Dubrovnik flies IFO 21. Its pilot is Captain Ashley J. Davis. His colleagues call him AJ.
Departure, IFO 21.
IFO 21.
From the cockpit, Davis can see some clouds ahead that he wants to avoid.
I'm left here just a couple of miles for a build-up.
IFO 21, this is approved as requested. Climb and maintain flight level 160.
Up to 160 now. IFO 21.
It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. AJ Davis and his crew have been on the go since dawn. While the cabin of this plane is built for comfort, the cockpit is virtually identical to a standard issue 737. AJ Davis grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and dreamed of being a pilot. He made it and has been on the front line of American military efforts. In the past, he flew mid-air refuelers high above the Persian Gulf. But now he pilots diplomats and other officials from around the world. It means a lot of traveling and a lot of time away from his wife and 2 children at Ramstein, an American base in Germany. According to the Air Force ranks, Shelley Kelly is a technical sergeant. Today on IFO 21, her main job is to make sure the passengers have everything they need.
Mr. Secretary, something to eat.
No, thank you. I was wondering how our time's
The
looking.
diplomats are expecting to arrive in Dubrovnik by mid-afternoon, but they've been running late all day.
You can check to find out for sure if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. Early would be good.
As the plane nears Dubrovnik, AJ Davis calls the United States Air Force Weather Service for an update.
Metro, IFO 21, how copy? Over.
IFO 21, copy loud and clear. Weather for Lima Delta uniform as follows. Rain. Sky conditions 500, broken. That would be ceiling. How well do you copy?
Metro, IFO 21, copies. Yeah, we've been in it all day. Are you expecting any changes in the weather?
Pretty much continued rain, over.
Copy. Rain. Thanks for your help. So, let's see the sights of Dubrovnik.
Only 4 months after a peace treaty was signed, the skies over this part of the world aren't guaranteed to be friendly. Planes are still required to fly in certain highly restricted lanes. While he's aware that there are flight restrictions, Davis has never flown in this part of the world before. As he nears the Croatian border, he gets an unexpected warning.
IFO 21, this is Magic 51.
Magic is the call sign for the peacekeeping airborne early warning aircraft that watches air corridors like a traffic cop.
Be advised, you're leaving an approved corridor. Please reroute immediately.
Davis isn't off course. He's flying the exact route he had planned. But without knowing it, Davis and his plane are flying out of approved airspace. They're flying into potentially dangerous territory.
You're leaving an approved corridor. Reroute.
Roger, Magic. Our error. Rerouting now to proper corridor. Over. The second time today.
The approved corridors do change, and Davis and his crew should have been informed. To stay on an approved course, Davis will have to swing out to the west. It's an embarrassing situation that's going to cost them time.
Shelley, AJ, we've been directed to reroute. We'll be arriving about 15 minutes late at Dubrovnik. Apologies to all back there.
Ladies and gentlemen, could I have your attention, please? Unfortunately, there will be a slight delay on our arrival into Dubrovnik.
DVs aren't going to be happy at all. The weather ahead will probably slow us down even more.
Outside his plane, the heavy rain continues to crash down. Flying toward an unfamiliar airport with a cabin full of businessmen and diplomats, Davis has a difficult task ahead. What happens to this plane and its passengers over the next several hours will capture the attention of the world. A heavy rain soaks a small airport in Dubrovnik, Croatia. Headed towards it is a US Air Force 737 carrying 35 people on a trade mission. Leading the delegation, US Secretary of Commerce Ron Brown.
We'll see which path Ambassador thinks we should follow.
Dubrovnik approach, IFO 21, level 100.
Dubrovnik approach, good afternoon. Maintain 10,000 feet for beacon approach. Runway 12.
Okay, descending to 10,000 feet, IFO 21.
The weather is so bad today that commercial flights have been cancelled. As they approach the airport, the rain isn't letting up. But the crew is dealing with more than just bad weather. The recent civil war has taken a heavy toll on Dubrovnik's airport. It had been closed for several years and is waiting for a new landing system.
The airport was totally trashed by the Serbs who had taken over the airport during the '91 war. They really went out of their way for the destruction. They destroyed the instrument landing system. The new one was on order.
Around the world, airports use sophisticated technology to help planes take off and land. Doppler radar warns of incoming storms. Glide slopes help pilots stay on course to land. The devastated Dubrovnik airport has none of that. It doesn't even have radar to see the planes that are coming in for landing. Instead, the airport is using so-called non-directional beacons to guide planes towards the runway. In the aviation world, it's ancient technology.
There are many non-directional beacons used in the United States and throughout the world, but they're an older navigational aid, and in fact, they were on the way out.
The system in Dubrovnik has 2 beacons on the ground, which send out signals to the plane. When the crew receives the signals, they consult their charts and follow the course that will take them to the airport. The crew of IFO 21 is still waiting to hear the first signal when they get a call from the ground.
9A CRO to IFO 21.
IFO 21, I read you, 9A CRO, over.
Another plane, this one carrying Ambassador Galbraith, had touched down earlier in Dubrovnik. The pilot of that plane is an experienced flyer who's very familiar with the area. He wants to let the crew know what to expect.
IFO 21, we landed about an hour ago. The weather was at minimum.
Adjusting the wording to split if you have to execute the missed approach. Over.
Roger, 9A CRO, we read you. Out.
Diverting wouldn't be welcome news for the members of the trade delegation.
The pressures to get the passengers to scheduled news conferences and other activities were probably pretty high.
As Davis closes in on the airport, the Dubrovnik tower calls again.
I-421, report level.
IFO 21, 5,000.
I-421, roger. Descend to 4,000. Report Kilo Lima Papa.
Down to 4,000, IFO 21.
Much better away. Seatbelt. Sir, good morning, thank you.
Flying above the storm, the crew finally hears the radio signal from the first beacon.
Engage. At Kilo Lima Papa, we're tracking outbound at 119 degrees.
119 confirmed.
Mr. Secretary, we're landing.
We'll take this up later, Adam.
It's not very broken up down there. I can't see through it. Tim?
The clouds are thick. The crew can't see the ground. They have to trust their instruments as they descend through the storm.
IFO 21. Sir, we are inside the locator, inbound.
I-421, roger. Cleared for beacon approach. Runway is what?
IFO 21.
A.J. Davis flies blind through heavy rain and cloud cover. He expects to see the airport any second.
I-421, do you read?
Just before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Dubrovnik Tower loses all contact with IFO 21.
I-421, Dubrovnik approach, do you read? I-421, do you read?
Without approach radar to track the plane, controllers have no idea where it is. Perhaps the plane has diverted to another airport.
I-421, do you read?
But as the minutes stretch on with no word from the American plane, local controllers are taking no chances.
Initiate emergency procedures.
Near the end of our shift, we heard about the possibility of a missing plane. We didn't know who was on the plane. We had no details about the flight. For situations like this, there is a certain procedure, and we just waited for more information.
Peter Galbraith is waiting at the airport with Croatia's Prime Minister.
It was clear from my own flight in that this was a very marginal landing. I did not expect them to attempt the landing in Dubrovnik. The Croatian Prime Minister came up to me and pulled me aside. He said, "We've lost radio contact with Ron Brown's plane." I got the State Department Operations Center on the phone, and he's asked to activate the U.S. military to start search and rescue activities.
Word goes out to the chain of air traffic control centers.
Američke borbene snage. Jeste li imali nekakav kontakt sa tim zrakoplovom?
But no one has had any contact with IFO 21. The search and rescue effort focuses on the approach to the airport. Perhaps the plane had ditched into the Adriatic.
At the time, I was about 100 miles away. I was in Brindisi, Italy. We launched 2 of our MH-53 helicopters with Special Tactics Air Force personnel on board, headed to Dubrovnik.
For hours, there is no sign of the missing aircraft. The weather conditions are getting worse.
Fog was in, thunderstorms in the area, low visibility.
IFO-21 Dubrovnik approach, do you read?
IFO-21 has a CPI, or crash position indicator, on board.
IFO-21, do you read?
If the plane went down, the CPI should be sending out an ultra-high frequency signal. But the Dubrovnik airport, as well as lacking radar, does not have the equipment to pick up the signal.
IFO-21 Dubrovnik approach, do you read? IFO-21, do you read? IFO-21, do you read?
As the hours pass, poor visibility frustrates the searchers.
They arrived off the coast, and they were over water looking for the crash.
Hours after the plane disappears, police respond to a tip. A local villager has seen something on the hill above his house. It's a long way from the coast where the search is concentrated.
We went up with 2 vehicles to check the mountains. The weather was extremely horrible. Strong rain and thick fog. So we went on foot for about an hour up that mountain. Then we came close.
It's almost 7:30 at night, 4.5 hours after the crew called for clearance to land. The crash of IFO-21 is finally confirmed. The news races from Dubrovnik to America.
The crash site has been reached by Croatian police, and I've just received word that there's also a Croatian doctor on the scene.
The tail section is the only substantial piece of IFO-21 that's left. Debris and bodies are scattered across the mountain.
These were hard moments as we were walking over the boulders, not knowing if we're going to step on someone's body. These are the moments that you can't forget.
Then, almost miraculously, police make a heartening discovery. Inside the tail section, they find a survivor. It's Technical Sergeant Shelley Kelly.
As we arrived at the tail section, one policeman went inside and found the body of a stewardess, and he tried to help. That was our hope. We wanted to help. We wanted to save every life, and hers was our chance. We were counting on it.
In the darkness, they realize that Kelly needs immediate medical attention if she's going to survive.
When I realized that there was no one to help, I radioed the police central station in Dubrovnik and got them the location of the crash site. By then, it was completely dark.
St. John's Hill is alive with close to 100 Croatian policemen and military. American forces are also rushing to the scene. Enormous rocks and treacherous conditions make the wreck site difficult to reach. But there are also remnants of the recent war. Mike Canavan is in charge of the US crash recovery operation.
I met a Croatian major. He told me that he was going to be the guide that would take us up to the top of the mountain. And at that time, he happened to mention that there were several minefields between where we were and the crash site.
It takes almost 2 hours for Canavan to finally make it up the rocky hill.
We had been walking for some time, and it was very dark. And all of a sudden, I saw something that was darker, and I didn't know what it was. And I reached out, and it was an aircraft engine.
On top of the hill, the weather is making it impossible for helicopters to land. Emergency workers can't wait for the weather to clear. They have to get Technical Sergeant Kelly off the mountain immediately. She has a broken spine and other severe injuries. But if she can be kept alive, rescuers hope she can shed some light on what went wrong. With Kelly off the mountain, the search for other survivors continues. Finally, in the darkness, rescue workers find the body of Ron Brown, the U.S. Commerce Secretary. In fact, as rescuers continue to comb the hillside, all they find are bodies. A.J. Davis and the rest of the crew were probably killed instantly. All the other members of the trade delegation are also killed. As dozens of emergency workers continue their grim search, a call comes from Dubrovnik. Technical Sergeant Shelley Kelly is pronounced dead in the ambulance en route to hospital. No one has survived the crash of IFO 21. A grim spring rain hammers down on the mountains of Croatia. Near the Dubrovnik airport, a 737 has crashed. The jet was an American Air Force's plane on a trade mission through the region. Police and members of the military have searched for survivors, but all 35 people who were on the flight are now dead. Including the American Secretary of Commerce, Ron Brown. In the darkness, the rescuers begin a very different job. Mike Canavan is with the U.S. Special Forces.
Once we realized there were no survivors, the mission changes. It goes from there's no one to rescue. Now you have to recover remains.
By dawn, the weather has improved. Peter Galbraith gets his first glimpse of the crash site.
We walked up the mountain. The weather was somewhat better. And near the top, there was the fuselage of the plane, rear part of it, and debris all over the place. And then on the other side of the ridge were the bodies. There's nothing in the world that compares to a plane crash.
One thing that my folks did on the mountain and then down in Dubrovnik is they did this with dignity and respect. And I thought it was done exceptionally well.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Vice President and the First Lady and the members of Cabinet and I wanted to come here to be with the employees of the Commerce Department at this very difficult hour. Hillary and I have just come from Ron Brown's home, visiting with Alma and Michael and their family and friends who are there.
As the truth sets in, the hard questions begin. How had a specially redesigned US Air Force 737 crashed on a hillside in Croatia? Was it simply bad weather? Or in a war-ravaged part of the world, was there another cause?
Purpose of the accident investigation team, I can guarantee you that they will be extremely thorough in their analysis in trying to determine the causes of this accident.
Because of the high-profile nature of the passengers, rumors begin swirling immediately. Howard Swansea is one of dozens of experts assigned to the team.
In every accident, there's always a lot of speculation. In this particular case, you had a high-ranking U.S. government official. And so by the time we had even got to the crash site, there was just quite a bit of media attention around it. And there were fragments, pieces of aircraft miles away from the wreckage. So my idea was to get as much information or collect as much artifacts or physical evidence as I could.
Right from the start, the investigation team is at a disadvantage. They discover that there's no cockpit voice recorder or flight data recorder on the plane. What's standard for passenger jets is not required in the Air Force.
I had assumed that the Air Force and these VIP flights had higher safety standards than commercial flights. And so I was really shocked to learn that the standards were generally lower than those for commercial aviation.
Without the standard tools, investigators can't afford to overlook anything. The wreck is almost 3 kilometers from the airport. How did a trained crew get so far off course? As Swansea examines the wreckage, Nelson Spornheimer is brought in to look at other evidence. An expert in aerial navigation, he plots the plane's doomed final minutes. To trace the last moments of the flight, he turns to the sky and the US Air Force radar plane, which had been patrolling the region.
IFO 21, this is Magic 51. Be advised, you're leaving an approved corridor. Please reroute immediately.
Rerouting now to proper corridor. Over.
Apart from heading out of approved airspace, Spornheimer finds nothing unusual about the plane's flight until the end.
The radar track that I was given was from an AWACS aircraft and showed that the en route portions of the flight from about 100 miles prior to the airport were entirely nominal.
The last segment of the flight, however, beginning 20 kilometers from the airport, is different. On their final approach, the plane begins to head off course. They start flying in a straight line, which heads right into the mountains.
My initial look at the flight track of the aircraft showed a 7-degree bearing error in the final segment of the approach.
A small error when traveling at hundreds of kilometers an hour could quickly lead to an enormous problem. But why would the plane get off course at the end of the trip if the rest of the flight showed no major navigational problems? Even in bad weather, how had the crew become so lost? Spornheimer examines the outdated navigational equipment at the airport. Badly damaged during the recent war, perhaps it had malfunctioned. 2 separate navigational beacons are used for landing in Dubrovnik. One guides planes to the runway, the other lets them know if they've gone too far. The first is located on nearby Kolosep Island. It transmits a specific Morse code signal to make it easily identifiable. When they hear it, all Davis and his crew need to do is fly a heading specified on their landing charts. If they do, they should eventually arrive at the airport. The second beacon is located at the airport itself. It's a fail-safe device. If the crew hears the beacon before they see the airport, they have to declare a missed approach and circle around to try landing again. In fact, the plane that brought Peter Galbraith to Dubrovnik just minutes before IFO 21 only landed on its second attempt.
IFO 21, I read you, 9ACRO, over.
Adjusting the verting to
Split if you have to execute the missed approach.
over.
Roger, 9ACRO, we read you. Out.
But after studying the equipment, Spornheimer doesn't believe it played a role in the crash.
Both the non-directional beacons were found to be operating normally by flight tests within a few days after the accident.
There are bizarre rumors of an even more sinister theory. Perhaps Davis was following a decoy beacon put in the mountains on purpose. In a troubled region, was this an attack on the trade mission?
To get a signal that is strong enough to be heard, you have to have a very large ground system, which is difficult to establish in rocky, sandy soil. So it would be very expensive and very time-consuming to set up an NDB in the mountains.
Such an elaborate scheme would be nearly impossible to pull off. No evidence is ever found of a decoy beacon. The investigation continues. In the wreckage of the Air Force flight, investigators discover an important piece of the puzzle. The plane's ADF, or automatic direction finder, is recovered. It appears to be working, but only one of the units had been installed on this jet. To perform a proper landing in Dubrovnik, a plane requires 2 ADFs. The device listens to the signals put out by the land-based beacons, but it can only listen to one at a time.
We're still not past it. I'm tuning back to KLP.
Flying with 1 ADF, the crew can listen to either the beacon which is telling them how to get to the airport, or the beacon which is telling them they've gone too far. They can't do both at the same time.
That would have required 2 ADF receivers in the aircraft, which the accident aircraft had only 1. And only having 1 ADF restricted their ability to follow the approach accurately.
I got CV. We're still not past it. I'm tuning back to KLP.
By quickly tuning back and forth between the 2 beacons, the crew can use 1 ADF to listen to 2 signals. But it would have added stress to an already difficult landing. And it's another surprise. The Air Force jet wasn't adequately equipped to land at this airport.
You're talking in a very short time span of making the approach. It's going to become rather difficult in trying to dial both to keep listening to the code if you're also trying to search for your course and headings.
As he continues to study the path that IFO 21 took, Nelson Spornheimer focuses on an S-shaped curve in the plane's flight. It's the sort of path a plane would take when looking for a signal from a non-directional beacon. But just when the crew should be looking for the beacon signal, the S-turns disappear.
At about 2 or 3 miles inside the final approach fix, for the next 7 or 8, 9 miles, the flight track is perfectly straight.
Instead of trusting the navigational system that was in place, even though it was primitive, the crew suddenly seems to give up. And Spornheimer thinks he knows why. Fighting heavy rain and hampered by a single direction finder, Spornheimer believes the crew resorted to another, even older piece of technology to find the runway, something called INS, or Inertial Navigation System.
An INS system uses gyroscopes to maintain an awareness of how much the airplane turns and banks.
After entering a specific geographical position at the beginning of a flight, an inertial navigation system tracks all the turns a plane makes. It's a self-contained system on the aircraft. But there is a potentially enormous problem. If the gyroscopes don't perfectly calculate every single maneuver of the plane, a pilot can be off course.
It's not very broken up down there. I can't see through it. Tim?
The crew might have thought that switching to this system would help them find their way. But in this case, it might have put the plane dangerously off course.
INS drift in this case was probably, in my view, the primary reason the aircraft ended up where it was.
Investigator Howard Swansea examines the Jeppson approach chart the crew was using as they attempted to land. Hampered by poor visibility and relying on the inertial navigation system, their charts would have been a key aid. But when he takes a closer look at it, he notices something peculiar. A key figure, the minimum descent altitude, isn't accurate. The minimum descent altitude is the height where pilots must be able to see the airport. If you can't see it at that height, you have to abort the landing.
Each country has the responsibility of developing these procedures and then publishing information so that other nationalities as well as their own air crews can fly those approach procedures.
Swansea discovers that the minimum descent altitude on the chart doesn't meet American aviation standards. Given the mountainous terrain, it should have been more than 2,800 feet. But the chart the crew was using said it was just over 2,100 feet. It means that the crew could have flown almost 700 feet lower than experts in the US thought was safe without having to abort the landing. Combined with the other problems the crew was dealing with, the non-standard chart sealed their fate. Struggling to find the airport, they were straining to see through the clouds, assuming they were still safely above the mountains. But why wasn't an Air Force jet properly equipped to land in Dubrovnik? And why didn't the crew have the right landing charts that would have made even a difficult flight safer? The answers are found at an American military base in Germany, with some of the most senior members of the Air Force. In the spring of 1996, a US Air Force jet crashed just outside the airport in Dubrovnik, Croatia. None of the 35 people on board IFO-21 survived. The plane was a specially redesigned 737, but the investigators have found that the crew didn't have the equipment it needed to safely land in the war-ravaged airport, and that the charts they were using weren't up to American aviation standards. To discover why the crew were attempting to land in such difficult circumstances, the investigators questioned Colonel John Mazurowski. He's the operations group commander for the airlift wing in charge of the flight. His job is to provide transportation for a growing number of distinguished visitors. But these are tight budget times. Mazurowski has been told to do more with less.
What I'd like to talk about now is the Jeppesen approach subject.
One of the major focuses of the investigators is the Jeppesen landing charts the crew were using. The charts, drawn up for most major airports, give crews a vast amount of information, including what to do in the case of a missed approach. But investigator Howard Swansea has already found that these charts were not up to US standards.
The Air Force had a directive that required all procedures in foreign countries to have gone through a US or their evaluation process prior to an Air Force crew being able to fly that approach.
Landing at the Dubrovnik airport had not been approved. The Jeppesen landing charts that did exist for the airport had not been reviewed. It's the reason that Howard Swansea found a difference between what the charts said and what was considered safe by the Defense Department. Mazurowski believed that restricting his planes to approved airports would severely limit some of his missions. It takes time to check all the airports out. He had asked for the review to be waived for some airports, including Dubrovnik.
This Jeppesen approach waiver, What caused you to initiate this?
It just seemed like we had been using these approaches for years. Safety didn't seem to be in question.
But the Defense Department waiver was never granted. The approach for Dubrovnik was never approved. Yet even without the safety clearance, the Air Force continued to land there.
IFO 21, level 100.
Dubrovnik approach, good afternoon.
The airport in Dubrovnik was far below modern standards. The charts used to land there hadn't been checked by the Department of Defense. Nevertheless, senior Air Force officials had decided to permit landing at Dubrovnik and other airports they were flying into.
In fact, none of them have been approved in this time frame.
Not to my knowledge, sir. No.
In the end, a fatal combination of factors had come together to cause the crash of IFO 21.
Dubrovnik approach, IFO 21, level 100.
Dubrovnik approach, good afternoon. Maintain 10,000 feet for beacon approach. Runway 12.
IFO 21.
The crew were fighting bad weather. They were landing in an unfamiliar airport, which was hobbled by old technology. The unapproved charts made a bad situation much worse. After an investigation involving nearly 150 interviews, the final report on the crash of IFO 21 exceeds 7,000 pages.
How much of the weeping we have done this last week because there were so many brilliant young people on that plane with him from different backgrounds and different racial groups. Why? Because Ron Brown could see in them the promise of a new tomorrow.
The results of the investigation fault several individuals and institutions. Dubrovnik Airport is singled out for an improperly designed instrument approach procedure. Today, automatic direction finders are no longer needed to land at Dubrovnik. The airport has replaced its approach equipment with the instrument landing system which was being delivered at the time of the accident.
I got CV.
The final report says A.J. Davis and his cockpit crew are responsible for flight errors. And, like a bullet piercing the heart of Air Force operations, leading military figures are blamed for a failure of command. In the aftermath of the report, 2 senior members of the Air Force are relieved of their posts. The Air Force severely reprimands Colonel John Mazurowski for dereliction of duty. He is demoted and eventually retires as a major. 13 other officers are also singled out for their roles in connection with the crash. The Air Force also changed the way it did business. All military aircraft were ordered to carry flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders. No aircraft is allowed to fly into an airport without approval from the Department of Defense, not even for high-ranking diplomats.
IFO 21. Sir, we are inside the locator, inbound.
IFO 21, roger. Cleared for beacon approach. Runway is 1.
IFO 21.
The Air Force Command was held accountable for the accident. But it's the pilots, the crew, and the passengers of IFO 21 who paid the ultimate price for oversights made by the 86th Airlift Command.
522, do you read?
High above Athens, fighter jets track a 737 as it circles the city.
522, do you read? Over.
There's no answer from the passenger plane, but there is someone at the controls. More than 100 people are on board.
Everybody's mind was going to a hijack or terrorist.
There is one person moving in the cockpit. Repeat, there is one person.
What happened to the crew and passengers?
522, do you read? Over.
And who is flying the plane?
Helios 522, do you read? Over.
Mayday, Mayday.
Early morning, August the 14th, 2005. The cabin crew of Helios Airways Flight 522 are preparing for their trip from the island of Cyprus to Athens, Greece.
Sure is a beautiful day. Maybe I shouldn't have come in.
Andreas Prodromou is 25. He isn't supposed to be working today, but he's taken the flight to spend some time with his girlfriend, who also works for Helios.
It's the sort of day I'd like to be out flying.
You will, Andreas.
Prodromou is a flight attendant now, but he has bigger plans. One day, he wants to fly for Helios.
Το όνειρο του ήταν να γίνει επαγγελματίας πιλότος.
His dream was to become a professional
Για πολλούς
pilot.
λόγους.
Personally, I wanted him to stay in the family
να μείνει
business.
μαζί μου, αλλά
We often talked about
παρόλο
this.
που έκαμε κάποιο διάστημα κοντά μου,
We've got company.
Stay warm at the back.
I will.
In the cockpit, the flight crew is occupied with the daily routine of preparing their jet for takeoff.
It's bright today.
Captain Hans Merten is an East German, a contract pilot hired by Helios for the busy holiday season.
Are you almost through? Pardon? You almost done. Nearly.
Body overheat lights.
His co-pilot is from Cyprus. Pambos Charalambous has been working exclusively for Helios for the last 5 years. Before beginning any flight, crews are required to perform dozens of checks on various pieces of onboard equipment.
Oxygen mask stowed.
It's a routine but necessary procedure.
Doors closed. Sorry, could you store trays? Pull your seat back.
Helios is a charter airline with low-cost fares to Greece. It's a summer weekend and the plane is filled with families. In all, there are 115 passengers on the morning flight.
If you need any more help, let me know. We're just about to take off.
They are low fare, no frills. They don't even serve you refreshments during small sorts of flights. But they offer another possibility for the budget-minded traveler.
Paros Dimitriou and Maria Rikou are traveling to the Greek island of Patros. They've just got engaged.
They booked this holiday a month or more than a month ago. It was like a honeymoon for them.
Flight attendants, please take your seats. Prepare to take off.
Just a few minutes after 9 in the morning, Helios Airways Flight 522 lifts off into the bright sunshine.
Nicosia Area Control, this is Helios 522. Request cruising at 340.
Helios 522, you are cleared to climb to 340. Have a good day.
Set 340. 340.
Minutes into the flight, the plane is still climbing towards its cruising altitude. Suddenly, an alarm blares in the cockpit.
What is it? The takeoff config warning?
The flight crew is confused. The takeoff configuration alarm normally only sounds on the ground. It tells pilots their jet isn't ready for takeoff. The crew doesn't know why it's sounding now. Uncertain what the problem is, the captain radios the Helios Operations Center at Larnaca Airport back in Cyprus.
Operations, this is Flight 522, over.
Flight 522, what can I do for you?
We have a takeoff config warning on.
Pardon?
Our takeoff config warning is on.
I'm sure it's nothing. I'll let you know when we level off.
With the first alarm still beeping in the cockpit, things become even more confusing. Their master caution alarm goes off. It could indicate that some systems on board are overheating.
We now have a master caution.
I'll get you an engineer. 522, just a minute. I find him very hard to understand. His accent is quite thick.
Flight 522, what can I do for you?
The ventilation cooling fan lights are off.
Sorry, can you repeat?
While the pilots and ground engineers try to troubleshoot the two alarms, most passengers have no idea there's a problem until...
Everyone, stay calm. Please remain seated.
Everyone, please put the oxygen masks on completely over your mouth and nose.
The protocol was immediately to secure yourself, grab an oxygen mask, stay in your seat. If you can help passengers without getting up, you could help them, and you should help them, but you would not risk the safety of any cabin crew member to go and help a passenger which is 5 or 6 rows further up.
Their procedure would be to grab their mask, don it, and wait for the aircraft to level off or commence with a descent.
No one in the cabin knows what the problem is. They're waiting for information from the cockpit. The pilots are unaware that the oxygen masks in the cabin have dropped, and they still don't know why their takeoff configuration warning is on, or why their systems are overheating.
Both of my equipment cooling lights are off.
This is normal. Can you please confirm your problem?
But the engineer on the ground is struggling to get a clear picture of what's happening in the air.
They are not switched off.
Can you confirm that the pressurization panel is set to auto?
Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?
Behind the captain's seat. Can you see them?
What's going on?
There's something wrong with the electrics on 522.
I had something to pick up from operations, so I was there. I figured, oh, not again, one of our problems. So I left. Oh, good luck.
The problem doesn't seem serious, but as the plane continues to climb, passengers still haven't received any information from the cockpit.
Helios 522, can you see the circuit breakers?
And now the engineer on the ground loses contact with the aircraft.
Helios 522, can you hear me?
It's less than 30 minutes after takeoff, and Flight 522 is still on course. The plane is high above the Mediterranean Sea and headed straight towards Athens. August the 14th, 2005. A Helios Airways 737 with 121 people on board is circling in the sky near Athens.
Helios 522, can you hear me?
Shortly after leaving the island
Over.
of Cyprus, 2 different alarms had been triggered on the plane. The flight crew was trying to solve the problem with the help of ground engineers. But now radio contact with the plane has been lost. Air traffic control can't get any response from the captain or co-pilot. The flight to Greece normally takes an hour and a half. But the passenger jet has been in the air for over 2 hours, circling in a holding pattern.
We heard that there was an airplane which was flying into the Greek territory and had no communication. Everybody's mind was going to a hijack or to terrorists.
More than 3 million people live in Athens. A plane slamming into the city could cause an incredible loss of life.
This is a runaway aircraft. It's a possible hijacking or it's a possible terrorist act, so let's involve the military.
The Greek Air Force scrambles 2 of its most sophisticated fighter jets to investigate the Helios plane.
Helios 522, do you read? Over.
But the pilots aren't getting any response. One of the jets flies closer to the cockpit. Someone is in the co-pilot's seat, slumped over the controls. But there's no sign of the captain at all. The fighter pilot radios air traffic control in Athens.
Athens ACC, there is one figure in the cockpit of Helios 522. He appears non-responsive. Athens ACC, checking the cabin.
He can see passengers in their seats, but none of them reacts to the presence of the jet. Then the pilot sees someone moving in the cockpit.
Athens control, there is one person moving in the cockpit of Helios 522. Repeat, there is one person inside the cockpit.
Helios 522, do you read? Over.
Helios 522, over. Flight HCY 522, this is Athens radar control. How do
The
you hear?
F-16s continue shadowing the jet, but there's no response at all from the cockpit.
One of them was actually in a shooting position behind the 737. The other one was nearby the cockpit and he was trying to communicate visually with the person in the cockpit.
Suddenly, the 737 turns left and begins to quickly descend.
Athens ACC, Helios 522 turning sharply. Following down.
From more than 10,000 meters, the plane drops towards the ground.
There is no structural failure, there is no fire, there is no problem, obvious problem from the external view with the plane.
Helios 522, over. Do you read?
Helios 522.
Do you read? Over.
Then, 2,100 meters above the ground, the person in the captain's seat acknowledges the fighter jet for the very first time. But no words are exchanged. Neither the fighter pilot nor local air traffic control can make radio contact with the jet. Just after 12 o'clock, almost 3 hours after it took off from the island of Cyprus, Helios Flight 522 slams into the ground.
Athens ACC, Helios 522 is down. Repeat, Helios 522 is down on Grammatico Hill. Over.
Fire and rescue workers rush to the crash site. There are no survivors. Flight attendant Lazaros Temetsian is stunned by what he hears at the company's operations center.
It was the most chaotic scene I've ever seen. When I went back, our operations controller said that he'd lost the aircraft and his eyes, he was starting to cry.
Helios is a small company with just 3 jets. Members of the cabin crew have been working together for years. For Paul Simeonides, news of the crash is particularly terrifying. He's a flight attendant for the airline, and so is his fiancée.
I think that must have been the worst 30 minutes of my life following that first image, because Victoria was flying that morning to Glasgow. I had everyone and his brother, every person we knew was calling me up to find out if I'm alive, if Victoria's alive, what happened, why it happened.
At first we said it takes 1 hour and a half to go to Greece, so probably it's not that plane. And it took about 2 or 3 hours later to know that Paris and Maria was on the plane that crashed.
Andreas Prodromu's father didn't know his son had been called to fill in on Flight 522.
I was told that Helios aircraft was lost by radar, and air controllers couldn't contact. I got worried. I called Andreas' phone. He always had it on. And unfortunately, he wouldn't answer. After that phone call, I felt as if the ground was pulled out from under my feet.
It's the worst air crash in the history of Greece. Most of the 121 victims are from Cyprus. The small island nation declares 3 days of mourning following the crash. It's an eerie disaster. For over an hour, air traffic controllers watched the passenger jet fly in radio silence closer and closer to Athens, with no idea what was happening inside the jet. Now, piece by piece, investigators are trying to find out.
So we climbed over the hill, and there we were, facing this situation, which was beyond any description. I saw a great area in front of me, which was burning. It was black. Burning, people spread, pieces of the airplane.
It is a truly nightmarish sight. I hope that I never experience it again.
Εύχομαι να μην τη ξαναζήσω.
It was terrible.
Δεν είναι κακή στιγμή, πάρα πολύ κακή στιγμή.
Investigators immediately start looking for the cause of the crash. In the early days, their efforts take a frustrating turn. They recover the box containing the cockpit voice recorder, but the recorder itself has been thrown clear.
It was difficult for us because we first found the case of the CVR very badly damaged, and we could not find the machine itself.
Investigators need to know what happened to the pilots. Without the cockpit voice recorder, they have little to go on.
So keep looking. Let's hope we can find it.
Bodies recovered from the wreckage are brought to the offices of Athens' chief coroner. Autopsies add more mystery to the case. Everyone on board the plane was alive at the time of the crash.
Υπήρχαν σενάρια.
There were scenarios at the time that they had all died in
ότι ήταν όλοι νεκροί στον αέρα. Η αιτία θανάτου είναι σαφής που την επανέλαβα πιο πάνω. Δεν υπάρχει καμία απολύτως αμφιβολία. Οι άνθρωποι σκοτώθηκαν.
But if the passengers were alive the entire flight, why didn't the pilot of the fighter jet see any activity inside the cabin? And who was at the controls as the jet circled over Athens? When investigators find tissue samples in the remains of the cockpit, they make a stunning discovery. The person at the controls of the plane when it crashed was flight attendant Andreas Prodromu, a last-minute addition to the cabin crew. But why was he in the cockpit? Was he trying to save the plane? Or did he deliberately fly it into the ground? Several days after finding the outer case of the cockpit voice recorder, investigators find the recording itself. When Chief Investigator Tsoulakis listens to the final moments of the flight, it answers a vital question.
Mayday. Mayday.
This was no
Helios
terrorist
Airlines.
act.
Flight 522.
Prodromou was
Athens.
calling for help.
Mayday.
Tsoulakis hears 5 separate maydays on the tape, even though none of them were heard by the air traffic controllers.
Από την πρώτη στιγμή που άκουσα ότι κάποιον πρόσωπο ήταν στο
From the first
πτωχείο,
moment that they saw someone in the cockpit,
δεν ήταν δηλός
believe me, I was
άνθρωπος.
certain it was Andreas.
Ήταν γνώστης του αντικειμένου
wasn't a coward.
του αεροπλάνου. Πίστευα ότι θα είχε τη
He knew
δύναμη να
something
μπορούσε
about
να
planes,
κάνει
and
οτιδήποτε
he had the
αν
capacity to do
έμπαινε
something.
πιο νωρίς για να μπορέσουν να σωθούν οι άνθρωποι μέσα στο αεροπλάνο.
In fact, Prodromou had his commercial pilot's license. It was the first step towards his goal of becoming a captain for Helios.
It's the sort of day I'd like to be out flying.
Oh, you will, Andreas.
But all of his training wouldn't have helped save the jet. When he was seen at the controls, Flight 522 had been in the air for almost 3 hours. And the reason the Helios plane seemed to veer away from the F-16s following it was because its left engine was out of fuel. No matter what caused the alarms to sound, the ultimate reason for the crash was simple.
The DFTR and the CVR gave us absolute proof that the plane ran out of fuel. And this was the cause of the crash.
Scheduled as a 90-minute flight, the plane didn't have enough fuel to stay in the air for over 3 hours. But why had the plane flown so much longer than it was supposed to? Tsoulakis now knows who was in the cockpit of the plane and why it crashed. But to fully understand the mystery, he needs more information. His investigators uncover a suspicious history of maintenance issues with the Helios jet. Issues that could help explain what happened on Flight 522. Less than a year before the crash, the same aircraft had suffered a rapid decompression. Lazaros Temetsian worked on that flight.
I was in the back of the aircraft at the time. There was a loud metallic bang, a clanging sound, and the oxygen masks dropped in the cabin. Every step I was taking was difficult. It was hard to move, hard to breathe. In fact, I was starting to pant. I was panting for air.
As the plane began an immediate descent to 3,300 meters, all Temetsian could do was remain strapped in and wait. Once the plane reached a safe altitude, Temetsian inspected the rear door and was shocked by what he found.
I noticed that the aft service door was not fully locked. The hinges on the top and the bottom of the door were kind of displaced. I could pass my hand right through.
There were no injuries, and the plane made an emergency landing, and the door was inspected. But this wasn't the only problem crews had with this plane.
We would record faults in the cabin logbook constantly, and nothing would be done to rectify even these small little problems in the cabin. Engineers would take months to rectify even the slightest problem in the cabin.
There were more recent problems as well. A Helios ground engineer tells Tsoulakis that on the very day of Flight 522, the 737 had another problem with its back door.
When we checked the flight log for the trip, we saw that we'd have to do some unscheduled maintenance.
The plane had arrived in Cyprus just after midnight on August the 14th. The cabin crew had heard loud banging noises and saw ice on the rear service door during the flight. It was scheduled to take off again just hours later. Soon after it landed, engineers began checking the problem. To make sure there's nothing wrong with the seal on the door, the engineers run a pressurization test. During normal flight, a plane's engines force air into the cabin. To ensure oxygen circulates during the trip, small valves in the rear allow some of it to leak out.
A pressurized airplane essentially is sort of like a pressurized can. Well, we pressurize the airplane so that the people inside can survive the environment that the airplane likes to operate in.
Switching digital pressure control unit from auto to manual.
Without the jet's engines running, the engineer uses the plane's auxiliary power unit to force air into the aircraft, and the cabin is pressurized for several minutes.
It's like looking for a leak in a tire. In this case, what you're having to do is pressurize the aircraft, use a barometer essentially to monitor the pressure inside, and look for leaks that way.
But there's no indication any air is escaping through the back door.
In this case, they felt that it was all right and they completed the test.
The entire jet seems to be in good working order. After performing a series of additional routine maintenance procedures, the engineers signed off on their technical log. Investigators are faced with a dead end.
So explain again how you tested the pressure.
An explosive decompression could have explained the tragic events of Flight 522. If the oxygen had been suddenly sucked out of the jet, everyone on board could have been overcome. But not only did engineers check the problem, when the F-16s approached the plane near Athens, no damage was seen. There was no indication that the fuselage was punctured.
Mayday.
Investigators are still struggling to solve the mystery. What had overcome the passengers and crew of Helios Flight 522? And why was one flight attendant apparently unaffected?
5.
The discovery of one small switch holds the key to the entire crash. The crash of Helios Flight 522 is one of the most mysterious air disasters ever.
Helios 522, do you read? Over?
All investigators know for sure is that shortly after takeoff, the crew stopped communicating with air traffic controllers.
Helios 522, over.
Mayday.
Then, after 2.5 hours in the air, one of the plane's
Helios
flight
Airways
attendants was seen at the controls. Eventually, the plane ran out of fuel and crashed, killing 121 people. But investigators are stumped. They still don't know what had happened to the plane's captain or the rest of the crew.
Tell me about what happened the day of the flight.
They concentrate on the conversation between the pilot and the Helios engineer shortly after takeoff. As the plane passed through 3,700 meters, an alarm sounded in the cockpit.
Operations, this is Flight 522, over.
Flight 522, what can I do for you?
We have a takeoff config warning on.
Pardon?
Our takeoff config warning is on.
Usually, the takeoff config warning is only triggered on the runway. But wreckage recovered at the crash site reveals no problems with the plane's flaps, landing gear, or anything else that could trigger the alarm. So why had it sounded? Chief Investigator Akrivos Tsolakis focuses on a small control panel found in the wreckage of the ravaged jet.
Are you sure this is the way it was found? It hasn't been moved at all.
We were lucky finding this panel which had the switch on the manual position was a major one.
Helios,
the P5 pressurization panel ensures that passengers have enough air to breathe, even at high altitudes. Normally, pressurization takes place automatically. As the jet climbs, its engines force air into the plane as they power it through the sky. But when the pressurization switch is set to manual, both the captain and co-pilot are responsible for maintaining the cabin atmosphere using a controller.
So explain again how you tested the pressure.
When I went into the cockpit, I turned the pressurization switch to manual.
Soulakis learns that during the early morning maintenance check on Helios 522, ground engineers had turned the P5 switch to manual. That allowed them to use the onboard generators to test the pressure seals on the plane's rear door without starting the engines. When the test was over, they didn't turn the switch back to automatic.
The procedure of pressurizing the aircraft has to do with setting the pressurization system from auto to manual. They were supposed to return the selector to the auto position.
Several hours later, when the flight crew entered the cockpit, the pressurization switch was still set to manual.
Lead air switches. It's bright today. Are you almost through? Pardon?
But neither the pilot nor co-pilot saw it. As a result, after takeoff, the cabin would not pressurize automatically. And the higher Flight 522 climbed, the thinner the atmosphere became. Not turning the switch back to automatic was a deadly, hidden danger.
Are you sure this is the way it was found? It hasn't been moved at all.
Soulakis believes this panel could be the key to the disaster. Leaving one switch on manual could have led to all the other problems the plane faced. To prove he's right, he takes an unusual step. 4 months after the disaster, he takes an Olympic Airlines 737 on the same route flown by the Helios jet. If he's right about what caused the crash, this plane should react exactly like the doomed airliner did.
Are we ready to go?
When there is a complicated accident like this, I think reenactments should be performed. Of course, it's expensive to have a jetliner flying for 3 or 4 hours, but it is worthy if you have to come with some results which benefit to the overall investigation.
Make sure the P5 is set to manual. It's hard to see.
In the cockpit, Soulakis has the crew turn the pressurization switch to manual. A green light indicates it's no longer on automatic. But in the bright glare of an early morning departure, the light is hard to see. As the reenactment flight climbs, oxygen is thinning quickly in the aircraft. The same thing happened on the Helios flight, triggering an alarm.
What is it? The takeoff config warning?
The alarm sounded, and that alarm was misinterpreted. Most of flight crew, they will never face an alarm with no pressurization in all their flight career because it's a rare event.
Soulakis confirms that the alarm went off because of the dangerously low air pressure in the aircraft. But he also discovers that the sound itself is identical to the takeoff config warning.
We have a takeoff config warning on.
But even if the flight crew did misinterpret the first alarm, they still had another chance to determine what the real problem was. At almost 5,000 meters, the plane's master caution light flashed on and stayed on for almost a minute.
We now have a master caution.
But once again, the pilots misinterpreted the cause of the alarm. The master caution light can indicate that the plane's systems are overheating. But it can also tell pilots the oxygen masks are down. In this case, it was doing both at the same time. But since the crew didn't think they were having pressurization problems, they focused on the plane's cooling systems.
The alarm about the non-cooling was a side effect of non-pressurization. Actually, it was not really that there was a high temperature inside the avionics bay, but it was the sensors that they were supposed to measure the temperature and the pressure in that area sensed that something was wrong.
On the recreation flight, investigators monitor instruments recording the same events occurring on board their aircraft. At the same time, they also begin to feel the effects of the lack of oxygen.
The first feelings you'd start to have were your ears would pop and you'd start feeling pressure in your sinuses. As you climb higher, you begin to feel almost giddy. It's almost like having a couple of drinks of alcohol.
The dwindling oxygen levels could also help explain some of the crew's bizarre behavior. When the ground engineer asked about pressurization,
Can you confirm that the pressurization panel is set to auto?
Captain Merton ignores the question and responds with one of his own.
Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?
You really don't notice it at first. It's amazing how subtle it can be in the early phases. They'd start feeling dizzy. They begin to lose the ability to think coherently. In a way, it traps you into the situation. You can't react to anything. Eventually, you're going to lose consciousness.
Soulakis believes that the captain may have been checking on the circuit breakers behind his seat when he and the co-pilot finally ran out of air. And unlike in the cabin, the oxygen masks in the cockpit do not automatically deploy if the atmosphere begins to thin.
Helios 522. Can you hear me?
On the other side of the locked cockpit door, no one in the cabin would have known that the plane was now flying itself. Nor would they have realized that a limitation of the passenger oxygen system had sealed the fate of everyone in the cabin. Passenger masks are supplied by a chemical generator above their seats. But the generators only produce enough oxygen to last about 12 minutes.
Well, the problem with the passenger masks is, for one thing, they're not designed to keep you oxygenated at a high altitude. What they're designed to do is give you enough oxygen so that you can survive until the pilots get the airplane down to a low altitude. In almost every event where we've had a decompression, that's been perfectly adequate.
For those who did put their masks on, they would have remained conscious for several minutes until their oxygen ran out. Then they too would have passed out.
Once you get up to 34,000 feet, you're talking useful consciousness of 30 to 60 seconds. Most of the people, once the hypoxia begins to cause them to lose consciousness, they're just going to go to sleep.
Without a flight crew, Helios 522 would have continued to Athens on autopilot. When the crew didn't take control, the autopilot would have put the jet in a holding pattern as it flew over the airport. Exactly the same thing will happen on the reconstruction flight if cabin pressure isn't restored. Soulakis asks the co-pilot to reset the P5 panel to auto before the jet continues to climb to its cruising altitude of just over 10,000 meters. Then, as it approaches Athens, Soulakis also has an F-16 shadow the jet, performing the recreation. He wants to confirm that it was Andreas Prodromou at the controls of Flight 522 when it went down.
We dressed one of our guys with the uniform of the steward. He came in, he sat on the captain's chair, and the F-16 was looking at him. He was confirming that it was exactly what he saw on the accident plane.
The reconstruction also answers another question about the tragic fate of Helios Flight 522. The cockpit voice recorder picked up several strange noises. They're heard just before Prodromou enters the cockpit. Soulakis confirms that these sounds were made by Prodromou using the electronic keypad to unlock the cockpit door.
We confirmed all those items and during the Reenactment flight, and it was very, very useful. It filled a lot of gaps we had.
Okay, take it down.
For Chief Investigator Tsolakis, the reenactment flight has been convincing. There was no dramatic cabin failure. Instead, a series of small mistakes and misunderstandings had led to the worst air disaster in Greek history. "15 months after the crash, Greek authorities released the official report on Helios Airways Flight 522. But mysteries remain. What was happening in the cabin while the doomed airplane flew towards Athens? And why was Andreas Prodromou the only one conscious at the very end? The crash of Helios Flight 522 was the worst disaster in the history of Greek aviation. Like many crashes, it was a fatal combination of mechanical problems and human error. The final accident report details a tragic series of oversights and false assumptions made by the flight crew. Problems that could have been easily prevented turned deadly for all 121 people on board.
Where are my equipment cooling circuit breakers?
Behind the captain's seat. Can you see them?
But what the final report does not do is explain what happened in the cabin of the plane. What actions did the flight attendants take? And why was Andreas Prodromou still conscious after almost 3 hours?
Mayday. Mayday.
Interviews with Helios safety instructors and crew members paint a tragic picture of what may have occurred.
Everyone, please put your masks on. We're not sure what the trouble is, but remain calm and please remain seated.
Prodromou was sitting at the back of the cabin. When the oxygen masks fell, he would have waited for instructions from the cockpit. The flight attendants sitting at the front of the plane would have done the same, but none of them would have waited forever.
We made it an issue at Helios to emphasize that cabin crew should not entirely depend on their procedures, but to think on their feet and to adapt to any impending situation.
In most depressurizations, the plane descends quickly. But as minutes passed on the Helios flight, the plane continued to climb. Unsure of what was going on, Prodromou would have tried to contact the flight crew.
Captain Merton.
But he gets no response.
Can you give us an update, please? Captain Merton.
With no word from the cockpit, he would have soon realized that this was not a typical depressurization.
When there was no call out from the cockpit and the aircraft didn't start an emergency descent, there was absolutely no protocol. They would be winging it.
By now, Prodromou must have felt that something was terribly wrong. But to find out what the problem was, he had to leave his seat.
The oxygen available on the 737 is, of course, the dropout oxygen. 10% of those masks are available for the crew in case of a depressurization incident. There are extra masks per every seat row.
Taking advantage of the extra passenger masks, he could have made his way to the front of the plane, a process cabin crew called monkey swinging. But if more than 12 minutes had passed, his girlfriend and the other flight attendant may have still been in their seats, and like the passengers, overcome by hypoxia. But Prodromou was a scuba diver and a former soldier in the Cypriot Special Forces. His training may have helped him to stay alert a little longer.
Andreas
was not a coward. He was a brave person. Fearless, brave and very calm.
But to survive after the passenger oxygen system stopped working, he needed another solution. The 737 had 4 portable oxygen bottles. Each one could last more than an hour. All 4 bottles were found at the crash site. 3 of them appeared to have been used. While the F-16 pilot saw Prodromou in the cockpit just before the crash, it may not have been the first time he had gone in. As he did at the end of the flight, he could have used the security code to unlock the door earlier.
The procedure would be to enter the flight deck via the cockpit door. Initially to bang on the door, and then, if no response is forthcoming, to enter the code and enter the flight deck.
During the accident investigation, DNA was discovered on an oxygen mask in the cockpit that matched the co-pilot's. It's possible Prodromou used it to try and revive him.
You can still revitalize somebody for quite an extended period of time if you get to them before major brain damage is set in. And that's somewhat a variable situation depending on the person, depending on how long they're exposed to a high altitude.
But if he was in the cockpit earlier, why did he leave? No one will ever know.
Probably was a little bit disoriented, a little bit confused. He's reacting a lot slower than he normally would.
What was his state of mind? What was his physical condition? We think that he knew what was really the problem, but is that the real situation? It's a real question.
After 3 hours in the air, everyone who didn't have bottled oxygen would have been unconscious. As it approached Athens, Flight 522 was now a ghost plane.
Most of the victims, they probably still had heartbeats when the airplane crashed, but almost certainly were in an irreversible coma.
Hypoxia is no more painful than falling asleep. But for Andreas Prodromou, the flight must have been a nightmare. As the F-16s roared to meet the jet, and with his oxygen running out, he must have known that he too was almost out of time. Yet to the very end, he didn't give up. Prodromou made one last attempt to save the plane. When he returns to the cockpit, the young flight attendant who dreamed of becoming a pilot calls for help. But no one can hear him, probably because the radio was still tuned to Larnaca, the airport on Cyprus where the flight had taken off. Fighting hypoxia and struggling to control an airplane larger than any he had ever flown, Prodromou was in an impossible situation. Even if he could have landed the plane, it was now too late. Flight 522 was out of time and fuel. There are pictures of Andreas in Cyprus, in the cemetery where he and his girlfriend Charis are buried side by side.
Σαν πατέρας προστιμούμε το γιο μου.
As his father, my son is in front of me. Wherever I go, he's always there.
Σ' άφησε ένα μεγάλο κενό.
He left a very big gap.
Δυστυχώς, δεν θα ξεπεραστεί ποτέ.
We will never get over it.
There are pictures in Greece, too. On the hill north of Athens, where Helios Flight 522 crashed, there are faded photographs of many of those who died. Bleached by the brilliant Mediterranean sun, they gaze over the rugged, ancient terrain, silent witnesses to one of the world's most bizarre and tragic airline disasters. the time, it was the worst crash in aviation history.
It was just a scene of absolute, utter devastation.
In 1974, more than 300 people died when their plane fell from the sky.
There's barely anything left here that's recognizable as being a part of an aircraft.
You couldn't walk anywhere without the danger you were going to stand on a part of a human being.
The key to understanding the disaster is found thousands of kilometers away. An unusual piece of evidence that tells the troubling story of a crash that could have been prevented.
Mayday, Mayday.
June the 12th, 1972. One of the newest members of American Airlines Fleet is in Detroit, Michigan.
John, Paige.
Flight 96, a brand new DC-10, is getting ready for takeoff. Captain Bryce McCormick and co-pilot Paige Whitney have been in the plane for hours.
Back there, so when we're in flight, if you can get a chance just to look at that.
Detroit is just a stopover on a flight from LA to Buffalo and then to New York.
You got there? You ready to try one, Paige?
All right, sir.
McCormick has flown the plane out from California, but Whitney is going to fly the next leg. Both men want as much time at the controls as possible. Neither one of them has more than 75 hours flying the DC-10. Few pilots have more. There simply aren't enough of the planes in the air. In 1972, the DC-10 had just been introduced. The plane is the latest advance to passenger jets. Its style and its size set it apart from other airliners. The McDonnell Douglas Corporation has spent more than $1 billion developing it.
In the late 60s, there was a race going among the three major manufacturers of jetliners, McDonnell Douglas, Boeing, and Lockheed, to see who could get the first jumbo out. So they got really busy on getting this DC-10 into production as fast as they could. And one of the things that they could not suffer were many delays based on some problem with the design.
American Airlines is one of the first companies to buy the plane. Flight 96 is one of those planes. Just the 5th DC-10 ever built. Cydia Smith has just been trained to be the chief flight attendant on the DC-10.
I was excited because it was one of the first jumbos that we had. And I was going to have the opportunity to fly number 1, which is what I always wanted to do on a big jet.
Okay, you got it? Hand on the wheel. I got you. V1, rotate.
Just after 7 in the evening, Flight 96 lifts off from Detroit Airport. Just minutes after takeoff, the plane is rising easily through 3,500 meters over Windsor, Ontario, Canada.
I was sitting in my seat, and the captain had turned off the fasten seatbelt sign, and I was making my way to the galley, and I had to go sort of downhill because we were climbing to go to the galley to turn on the coffee. when I punched the coffee and I moved over to one side, that's when it happened. I remember falling over because the plane was like this, but all of a sudden it just went like this. I saw ceiling compartments fall, and I saw things coming out of pockets and everything, and I thought to myself, oh boy. It felt like the last day of my life.
We hit something! We lost an engine here!
In the cockpit, the crew is fighting for control of their jet. The throttles which control the 3 engines have snapped to idle. The plane loses almost all its thrust. The huge jet begins slowing down.
The plane immediately took a huge drop. And the next thing that happened was I was hit in the face with a piece of the plane. My husband was frantically trying to find a stewardess to give me something to put a pressure on my face to stop the bleeding.
Let me have it!
McCormick takes over control of the plane. He and Whitney wrestle the jet level. But Flight 96 has been badly damaged.
Have we got hydraulics? No, I've got full rudder here.
The rudder on the tail, which controls the direction of the jet, is jammed to the right. That's forcing the plane to swing dramatically in that direction. While McCormick fights to turn his damaged plane back to Detroit, Cydia Smith is shocked to see a gaping hole in the floor of the main passenger cabin.
People were asking me, what to do, and I knew that I didn't know what to tell them.
Smith has been able to account for all of her passengers. But flight attendant Sandra McConnell is missing.
Sandra! Can you hear me? Sandra, where are you?
And finally, I saw her come out of one of the bathrooms.
McConnell has to cross the hole in the floor to move to safety.
And almost every step she took, the floor kept collapsing.
The crew brings up power to the engines on the wings. But the third engine on the tail stubbornly refuses to respond.
Center, this is American Airlines Flight 96. We got an emergency.
American 96, roger. Type of emergency?
We've got a jammed rudder. We need to get down and make an approach.
Along with his engine and his rudder, McCormick is also having trouble controlling the elevators on the tail of the plane. They help him move the massive plane up and down. They're slow to respond, but he can move them. The situation isn't completely hopeless.
I think it's going to fly!
American 96, turn further right, heading 200.
Without complete control of the elevators, and with a rudder that's frozen to the right, McCormick has to use his engines to turn the plane. By increasing the thrust on one side of the plane, he can change direction. But it won't be fast.
I have no rudder control whatsoever. So our turns are going to have to be very slow and cautious.
All of the passengers move as far away from the hole in the back as possible. But apart from the cut to Loretta Kaminsky, so far there are no other serious injuries.
Captain, there's a hole in the back of the plane.
A hole?
Yes, sir. What do you want us to do?
Get everyone ready for an emergency emergency landing.
Bryce McCormick's DC-10 is badly damaged. The lives of everyone on board now depend entirely on his ability to land a plane that can barely fly. With explosive suddenness, a short flight from Detroit to Buffalo has become the most challenging flight of Captain Bryce McCormick's career. He's down an engine, and he can't move his rudder. As he heads back to Detroit, McCormick begins to slow his plane down so it can land safely. But when he does, his plane begins falling dangerously fast. Ideally, McCormick should be descending at 700 feet a minute. But now he's falling more than twice that fast. 1,600 feet per minute.
What's the sink rate? Sink rate, 1,600!
At this rate, McCormick will crash well short of the runway. He increases power to his engines to slow his fall.
Sink rate, 700.
McCormick has slowed the plane's descent to 700 feet per minute. But to do that, he's had to increase his forward airspeed, which means he'll be landing far faster than usual. For the first time since the beginning of the crisis, McCormick talks to the passengers.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking.
We've had a small problem, but the plane is under control now, and we're heading back to Detroit for an emergency landing.
Bryce McCormick was as calm as if he were welcoming you on the plane.
As the plane nears the airport, flight attendants ask passengers to remove their shoes and any sharp pieces of jewelry.
They had to take off their shoes and glasses. We collected everything in a blanket.
Less than half an hour after leaving, the badly damaged DC-10 struggles back to the Detroit airport.
The few minutes that it took to get back to Detroit were the longest minutes that I will ever remember spending on an airplane, because we were sure that we were not going to survive.
Captain Bryce McCormick now needs to give the jet even more power to push the nose up for landing. His plane is still drifting to the right and traveling fast.
I have no rudder to straighten it out when it hits.
The DC-10 with 67 people aboard roars toward the runway at almost 300 kilometers an hour.
The landing was the most frightening part of the entire flight.
When the plane hits the ground, it begins veering hard to the right.
Once the plane landed, it seemed like we just went on forever. I mean, it was just forever.
One set of landing gear wheels runs off the runway and through the grass. After a harrowing touchdown, the plane eventually comes to a stop just 300 meters from the end of the runway.
Okay. Engines off at your discretion.
Shut him down.
Every woman wanted to hug him, and he was just amazing, because it was just at that moment that we all realized that we were alive because of him, that he literally had saved our lives.
If you take a look at something like this and you say, well, there's good flying and there's bad flying, this is beyond good. This is superlative. This is using every instinct you have as an airman and all the capabilities you have to stay calm enough to get the situation assessed.
With the plane on the ground, the crew has its first opportunity to inspect the damage.
The captain and I walked back when everybody was off. We walked back to the back, and we just looked up and saw this hole. And it was just so weird.
There's no indication that the jet hit something as the pilots first thought. What has caused such damage to the airliner?
The hole was so enormous that if anyone had been sitting in the seats that were there, they would have been sucked out immediately. At that point, they still felt it might have been a bomb.
But while the incident had happened with explosive suddenness, no indication of a bomb is found. As investigators begin their work, they discover that not all of the DC-10 is at the Detroit airport. A coffin that the plane was carrying in its cargo hold is discovered 30 kilometers away from the Detroit airport, near Windsor, Ontario, Canada. Investigators also find the plane's rear cargo door.
Doors are not supposed to fall off airplanes, especially since it was a rather new airplane. You would not expect something like that to happen.
When they examine the cargo area of the plane, they discover that the very design of the door makes it a potential weak spot. Most doors on a jet open inward. In fact, the door is slightly larger than the frame it fits into. As the pressure builds inside a jet, this type of plug door is actually forced into the frame of the aircraft. The design makes the door extremely safe. But McDonnell Douglas designed the cargo door on the DC-10 to open outward. That decision was made to increase the amount of storage space on the plane. When it's closed, hooks on the DC-10's door grab hold of a bar on the plane's door frame. To make sure it's closed, baggage handlers push down on a lever, which drives locking pins through the hooks, which hold them in place. When investigators examine the cargo area of the plane, they don't find any structural damage around the door. When they study the locks on the cargo door itself, they find that the latches are not completely closed. And the pins that are supposed to make sure the door is locked are not in their locked position.
When we interrogated the cargo handler that closed the door, it became immediately apparent that he used excessive force to close the door. And in fact, he said he had to use his knee to get the door handle to go flush.
Investigators make a frightening discovery. It's possible to close the lever on the outside of the door, even if the hooks and locking pins are not in the closed position. Paul Eddy is a journalist who investigated the history of the DC-10.
What Windsor showed is that you could actually pull the handle in order to buckle the top fixture so that the handle went home properly, but the locking pins had not gone through the spools.
Engage the lever. This means that baggage handlers can believe the door is closed when it's not. Not only can the outside lever be closed without the locks being fully engaged, there's no way for the crew of the plane to know. The faulty locking pins will still turn off the warning light, even though they aren't in their proper position. The door was a ticking time bomb. As passenger jets climb, the difference between the pressure inside the plane and the pressure outside the plane grows. If a door isn't properly shut, it will blow out with explosive force. The problem on the American Airlines flight began as the plane passed through 3,500 meters. When the door blew, the coffin in the cargo hold was sucked out. When the air pressure inside the plane was released, anything that wasn't firmly attached was pulled out of the airliner.
It's a really startling thing if you're not expecting it. What you've got is a lot of air stuffed inside this pressure vessel that now wants to get out. And the bigger the airplane is, the more powerful the hurricane of air leaving the airplane is during that period of time.
By itself, explosive decompression does not make a plane unflyable. So why had Captain McCormick experienced such difficulties controlling his jet? Investigators take a closer look at the back of the plane's cabin and learn that the very design of the DC-10 makes it vulnerable. When the cargo door blew off, there was so much pressure on the floor of the cabin that it collapsed into the cargo compartment below. When it did, the floor ripped into some of the plane's critical control systems.
When it collapsed the floor, it took the cables that controlled number 2 engine, and it took most of the cables, or impeded most of the cables that had to do with the flight controls in the back.
I think it's going to fly!
It left McCormick just enough control to keep his plane level. The remarkable flying of Bryce McCormick had saved the lives of everyone on board Flight 96. But there was a problem with one of the newest and most expensive planes flying over North America.
In the Windsor incident, there was an obvious flaw. And that's where the NTSB said, look, here is really the smoking gun, the ability to close that thing without having all those locks engaged. Let's make sure we change this system right now. Every DC-10 operator needs to know this.
I want everything checked. I want all the bolts checked first.
Chuck Miller is the head of the NTSB's Aviation Safety Bureau.
You have to check all the latches, okay? Every single latch.
It's his responsibility to point out problems with the new DC-10 and propose solutions. He helps write the fixes he thinks McDonnell Douglas needs to make to keep the plane safe.
He was a very, very professional man, and he had his investigators had enormous respect for him. Chuck didn't sit back in the office. Chuck was always on the scene.
For Chuck Miller, fixing the DC-10 is a matter of professional pride. For McDonnell Douglas, the near accident over Windsor has enormous implications. Their billion-dollar gamble came close to tumbling from the sky. If anything else goes wrong, the company itself could be at stake. March the 3rd, 1974. A perfect spring-like day in Paris. It's been almost 2 years since a DC-10 came close to crashing near Windsor, Ontario. Now more than 50 of the new planes are flying around the world. One of them, Plane 29, is owned by Turkish Airlines. Normally, the last leg of this trip from Turkey to England wouldn't be very crowded. But today, the DC-10 is filling up fast. People are squeezing into seats throughout the plane. A strike at a British airline has passengers scrambling for any flight back to London. Wendy Wheel is one of many last-minute additions to the flight. A model, she's returning home after a shoot in Spain.
We'd been married for 18 months, and we were about to start a family.
I believe the secret of her success for modeling was not just that she was a very attractive girl and good model material, but she was generally liked by all the photographers because she had such a pleasing, lovely, light personality.
With all the new passengers boarding, the flight is a little behind schedule. And it's not only the crew who are waiting. At the back of the plane is baggage handler Mohammed Mahmoudi. With all the new passengers, he's not sure if there are any more bags to load.
C'est tout. Vous êtes fini. Bien, j'ai l'affaire.
Not expecting any other luggage, Mahmoudi locks the rear cargo door. The DC-10 is set to go. Just after 12:30 in the afternoon, THY Flight 981 lifts off into the skies above Paris. London is less than an hour away.
Race control, this is Tango Hotel Yankee 981. We're at 60, requesting clearance to flight level 230.
Tango Hotel Yankee 981, you are cleared to flight level 230.
981, roger.
As it flies away from the airport, the DC-10 continues to gain altitude. 2,700 meters, 3,000 meters, 3,300 meters. The huge jet shudders and banks to the left.
What happened? The cabin blew out! Are you sure?
Just 16 seconds after the start of the crisis, the crew struggles to save their crippled jet. The nose is pitching down, the plane picking up speed.
Bring it up! I can't bring it up! She doesn't respond!
Passengers at the back of the plane witness a horrifying scene. 2 rows of seats have simply disappeared. Through a huge hole in the floor, passengers can see the sky over France.
7,000 feet! Hydraulics! We've lost it!
The crew discovers that they have no hydraulic power with which to control the plane. Without it, they can't move their rudder or elevators. Even without its most basic controls, the plane begins to level out. But it's fallen too far.
Looks like we're going to hit the ground! Speed!
The DC-10 is traveling almost 800 kilometers an hour. The flight from Paris to London never even makes it to the English Channel. Just 9 minutes after taking off, Turkish Airways Flight 981 becomes the worst plane crash of all time. In London, the flight is listed as delayed. The news of the crash comes out slowly.
I went to the ticket office kiosk and I asked what has happened to the flight, and instantly the look on the gentleman's face behind the counter told me something was wrong, instantly.
There's barely anything left here that's recognizable as being a part of an aircraft.
I looked on the television and I just thought, well, I just hope she's dead, because I just saw the carnage of the forest in Senlis, and it was like looking at a First World War trench movie.
Flight 981, carrying 346 passengers, virtually disintegrates on impact. There are no survivors.
It was just a scene of absolute, utter devastation. And the litter of personal possessions, electric wires, bits of metal, bits of bodies, just strewn everywhere. I mean, you couldn't walk anywhere without the danger you were going to stand on a part of a human being. I still have nightmares about this, even though it's 33 years ago.
Investigators for the French Accident Investigation Bureau are quickly on the scene.
My first job was to evaluate the scope of the wreckage and to begin the first investigation on the spot. At first, I was unable to know what has happened. I was just seeing that a terrible crash has occurred and that it will be a very hard work for the investigators.
Despite the enormous force of the crash, the black boxes, made of 3 layers of hardened steel and insulation, survive. Their contents could provide valuable clues about the crash.
Most of the speculation was that it must have been a bomb, because, you know, you've got a almost brand new, very powerful aeroplane flying in clear blue sky, and it gets to 12,000 feet and falls out of it.
Investigators are called to a field 15 kilometers from the crash site. They find a piece of fuselage and 2 rows of seats from the DC-10. Somehow, they fell free of the airliner before the rest of the plane smashed into the forest. When investigators arrive, the bodies of the passengers who were in the seats have already been removed. When relatives of those who died in the crash arrive in France, they're directed to a small church in the town of Senlis.
One of the saddest sights I've ever seen is in this church. They laid out on tables everything they'd found, you know, clothing, possessions, teddy bears, rings, watches. And then relatives who wanted to were allowed to come and walk around these trestle tables with all this stuff laid out.
They produced a little packet with my wife's wedding ring and rings, engagement ring. It was all pretty battered up, so you can imagine the thoughts that went through my mind.
Since the accident involves an American plane, the NTSB's Chuck Miller joins the investigation. For the second time in 2 years, he's dealing with a problem with the DC-10.
I don't believe that Miller suspected for one moment that the door hadn't been fixed after Windsor.
But it becomes clear that the piece of fuselage found in France is in fact the plane's rear cargo door. It seems like a repeat of the Windsor accident. Miller is left with a haunting question. Why hadn't the problem been fixed?
When he saw the door, of course, saw that it hadn't been done. The fix hadn't been made. And that's when I think his anger became very, very strong indeed.
Miller takes an unusual step. Although the official investigation is just beginning, he gives journalist Paul Eddy an important tip.
I said, have you got any ideas what made the door come off? He said, yeah. If I were you, I'd go and look at a place called Windsor, Ontario.
Hello. I'm Chuck Miller.
Miller shares his suspicions with the French investigators.
Could you please pass these around? These were taken on June 12th, 1972, right after the incident.
We have asked for the report on the Windsor accident, and our American colleagues were also volunteers to give us a lot of details.
Now, we had an American Airlines flight from Detroit to Buffalo have its cargo door blow off.
And he has been very frank and had explained what he was thinking of the Windsor accident.
After all the work done during the American Airlines investigation, had something been overlooked? Was there another problem with McDonnell Douglas's enormous plane? With the information from Chuck Miller, French investigators take a closer look at the plane's cargo door. They make a shocking discovery. There is no new problem. It's just like the American Airlines case all over again. The latches that are supposed to hold the cargo door closed aren't locked. And since 2 rows of seats were sucked out of the DC-10 over Paris, it's clear that the floor on the plane collapsed, just as it had in Windsor.
It looks like we're going to hit the ground!
In fact, when investigators listen to the cockpit voice recorder, they find that the Turkish flight crew had even less control of their plane than the crew of American Airlines Flight 96.
We need to get down and make an approach. I think it's going to fly!
Over Windsor, Bryce McCormick was able to recover his plane and land it. But in Paris, all the hydraulic systems were destroyed.
We've lost it!
The hydraulic fluid helps crews move the rudder and elevators on the tail. Not being able to control them meant the crew couldn't keep their plane in the sky.
The basic problem was the Paris flight was much heavier in terms of the number of people on board. The floor, when it collapsed with such a tremendous amount of pressure that it literally severed all the cables and control to the back. They had no hope after that point.
You and each of you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about
Shortly after the crash of Turkish Airlines Flight 981, Chuck Miller is back in the United States.
Our first witness this morning is Mr. C.O. Miller, Director of the Bureau of Aviation Safety of the NTSB.
This time, he's facing questions from American senators.
A potentially catastrophic design defect.
A special hearing begins to find out how a problem that was identified in 1972 could bring another plane down 2 years later.
Of course, our understanding up to this time, they all had been.
What you've got to now discover is why wasn't that door fixed? Why would a major, venerable, mighty American corporation deliberately do something like this?
Less than a month after the near crash over Windsor, the NTSB had made 2 very specific recommendations. Miller and his investigators recommended that a change be made to the locking mechanism.
Engage the lever.
They wanted to make sure that it was physically impossible for baggage handlers to close the lever without the locking pins being in place. They also suggested that vents be put into the floors of all DC-10s. This would rapidly allow the pressurized cabin air to equalize without collapsing the floor. But in the 2 years since the accident, neither one of these recommendations was implemented.
There is a fundamental problem at the heart of aviation safety, and has been in the United States for a very long time, and that is that it's the job of the NTSB to discover what's happened and to come up with recommendations as to how to prevent it happening again, but it has absolutely no authority to implement them.
The NTSB does not have regulatory authority. They have to turn to the FAA, as they did, and say, we want these things done. And that's where the system went wrong.
If the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, issues an airworthiness directive, planes are pulled out of service until the proper fix is made. But as serious as the problems on the DC-10 were, no airworthiness directive was ever issued. A so-called gentleman's agreement between the head of the FAA and the head of McDonnell Douglas stopped it from happening.
The gentleman's agreement is the root cause of Paris. There is no question that if an airworthiness directive had been issued, as it should have been after Windsor, Paris would not have happened. It was an entirely avoidable accident.
McDonnell Douglas assured the FAA that it would fix the problem voluntarily. An airworthiness directive would cast a shadow on the still fledgling DC-10.
The last thing in the world you want is for the public or any of the airlines who are going to be operating these airplanes to think, oh, maybe there's some flaws in this bird. And so an airworthiness directive, especially one that requires you to go back and re-engineer something, is a really horrific thought for a manufacturer.
McDonnell Douglas did make changes to the way the cargo door was built. A peephole was cut in the bottom of the door so baggage handlers could see if the locking pins had engaged. Several warning signs were also attached to the plane's door. The company also made other changes to the DC-10. These included increasing the length of the locking pins and attaching a plate to the inside of the door. This plate would make it physically impossible to push down the lever if the door wasn't properly locked. But each of the proposed fixes had its own problem. Many baggage handlers didn't know what the small window in the door was for. And the baggage handler in Paris read and spoke 3 languages, but not English, the only language in which the warning signs were written. The support plate that was supposed to be installed in the door was never attached to the jet that crashed in Paris. Papers confirming the completion of the work are also uncovered. But no matter what the paper trail says, the fix was never made.
Again, the problem is you don't have an independent FAA inspector coming along to look and see it and then put his stamp on it, because it wasn't an airworthiness directive.
In the years following the Turkish Airlines crash, an enormous flurry of lawsuits are filed in California. The tragic story of the DC-10 has one more surprise in store. It's 1974, and an unprecedented series of lawsuits are being filed against McDonnell Douglas. The families of those who died near Paris want someone held responsible.
As time went by, I learned more and more about what actually happened and realized that it was not an accident as we would call an accident. It was totally avoidable. My goal was to expose these people.
In the weeks leading up to the trial, lawyers who are involved in the case have access to the entire history of the DC-10's development. They're not the only ones who pore through the evidence. So does journalist Paul Eddy.
We were determined to get to those documents and that testimony. Somebody gave us a key to the depository where the documents were, and so at night we would go in and then had a huge accumulated pile of documents to go through in order to find out what they've been up to.
Reading through the immense pile of paper, Eddy makes an incredible discovery. A memo written by Don Applegate, the Director of Product Engineering for Convair, the company who'd built the cargo door for McDonnell Douglas.
I think the point when we knew we got them was the Applegate memorandum that specifically pre-warned this would happen.
The memo is a damning indictment of the cargo doors that were being made for the DC-10 and the lack of venting in the cabin floors. It warns that it's only a matter of time before there's a major disaster involving the doors.
The airplane demonstrated an inherent susceptibility to catastrophic failure when exposed to explosive decompression of the cargo compartment.
The memo, written just weeks after the near disaster in Windsor, recommends that immediate changes be made to the DC-10 cargo door.
You know you've got them. You know you've got them because you know they knew.
During the court case, another chilling find is made. Not only did McDonnell Douglas know about the problem after Windsor, they knew during the development of the DC-10. 4 years before the Paris crash, 2 years before Windsor, the cargo door failed during a pressure test. The company knew there was a problem, but the fundamental design of the door stayed the same.
I could not believe a large corporation, McDonnell Douglas at the time, could do such a thing, could risk our lives, ordinary people's lives, for the sake of money.
Well, in aviation, it's called tombstone technology. In other words, we always have the balance of money. And unfortunately, over the years, it has been true more times than not that we have had to wait until we had enough people die in an accident to say, you know, we really are going to have to spend the money over here.
The Applegate memo and other information that comes out during the court case leads to one of the biggest settlements in the history of aviation. McDonnell Douglas paid over $80 million in damages. After the Paris crash, foolproof changes were finally made to the DC-10 cargo door. And this time, nothing was left to chance. The FAA issued an airworthiness directive that ensured the doors would never again open in mid-air. And it worked. After Paris, there wasn't another serious incident involving the cargo doors on a DC-10. But the plane's history and an intensely competitive industry did have an impact. McDonnell Douglas sold far fewer commercial DC-10s than it had once hoped for.
Most of the pilots that I know who have flown the DC-10 over the years really love the old bird. She's probably a little more clunky than the 747 in terms of her heaviness of flight controls, but it's still a lovely bird to fly.
That's fine, but you can't disassociate either the airplane or the company from the awful reputation that the crash left.
Eventually, McDonnell Douglas itself disappears. The company was bought by Boeing in 1996. In the forest outside Paris, a monument now stands honoring those who were killed on Flight 981. A permanent reminder of one of the most disturbing crashes in the history of aviation.
You never forget. And I've gone on to lead my life for 30-odd years, but I've never forgotten. People to this day think it was an accident, and it wasn't.
A crowded 747 has disappeared over the Atlantic.
Air India is not showing up.
Pieces are found scattered on the ocean surface. But the vital clues are deeper than any air crash investigation has ever gone.
In this accident, we had nothing.
It was just mind-boggling.
An international recovery effort goes to the very bottom of the sea to rebuild the shattered plane. What they discover will send shockwaves around the world. Early morning, June the 23rd, 1985. A 747 flies across the Atlantic Ocean, 9.5 kilometers above the water. The jumbo jet is nicknamed Kanishka, after an Indian emperor. And Air India promises passengers it will be a palace in the sky.
Indian hospitality is something that the culture prides itself on, and you do experience that when you fly Air India. The colors are rich and warm inside. It's your gateway to India.
On its way from Canada, the plane is heading to London, England, before continuing on to New Delhi. It's been in the air for 4.5 hours. Captain Hansay Narendra is a veteran Air India pilot. Satwinder Binder is a captain too, who's serving as first officer on the flight. As the plane nears land, Binder talks with the flight's purser.
Yes, sir?
Insha, do me a small favor. At the back of the plane, seat 54, a boy is sitting there. He just wanted to have a look in the cockpit.
Can I send him now?
After about 15 to 20 minutes.
There are 329 people on board, including passengers and crew. Many of them are flying to India to visit family or friends. Vishnu Pada is traveling to India with his 2 daughters. Their mother, Lata, is already waiting for them there.
We had decided that it would be the ideal year to take an extended vacation in India as a family.
6 minutes after 8 in the morning, co-pilot Binder makes radio contact with air traffic control in Ireland.
Shanwick, Air India 182, good morning.
Station calling Shannon. Go ahead again, please.
Thomas Lane and Michael Quinn are working at the Shannon Control Center.
Air India 182 is 51 north, 15 west at level 310. Estimate FIR at 0735.
Air India 182, Shannon, roger. Cleared for London, flight level 310.
Air India 182 is cleared to London, maintain 310.
Do you want to come up front now?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's go.
It's a light morning at Shannon Control. They're dealing with just 3 planes. But something peculiar has happened.
The signals are all jumbled up.
The signals on radar merged so that it was totally impossible to read the call signs and flight levels of any of the 3 aircraft.
The Air India 747 is flying at 31,000 feet. A TWA jet is several thousand feet above it, and a CP flight is 2,000 feet higher. All are traveling east. Because the planes are stacked on top of each other, the signals have merged on the controller's two-dimensional screen.
Tom moved the tracker ball on radar and separated the signals.
Two of the planes reappear on the radar, but the Air India flight has vanished.
Air India's not showing up.
Hold on a minute. Air India 182, do you read?
Air India 182, this is Shannon, do you read? Over.
It's 8:14 in the morning.
I had a gut feeling. To this day, I don't know why I picked up the phone.
Yes, it's Michael Quinn at Shannon. We have a plane off radar.
Normally, a distress call to search and rescue isn't made until a plane has been out of contact for more than 20 minutes. The Air India flight has been missing less than 60 seconds. Several ships in the area begin searching for signs of the plane. Its last known position is some 290 kilometers southwest of Cork. Just 2 hours after the plane disappears, a Canadian-owned cargo ship in the area confirms the worst. The first pieces of wreckage are discovered. Uninflated life rafts are spotted bobbing in the cold Atlantic. Then bodies are seen. It's quickly clear that no one has survived. In India, Lata Pada is waiting for her husband and 2 children to arrive when she hears the news from her brother.
He sat me down and told me that, something terrible had happened. I was just in total shock, and, part of me was trying to digest the information, and part of me was trying to imagine if indeed the worst had happened, how I was going to continue my life without them.
Dozens of bodies arrive in Cork. Many more will follow. Now investigators are faced with the enormous task of finding out how they died and what had caused the crash of Air India Flight 182. "130,000 people live in the city of Cork. Tucked into the southern coast of Ireland, it's long been a vital seaport. On June the 23rd, 1985, a gruesome cargo begins arriving at the city's docks. Just hours after Air India Flight 182 crashes into the sea, bodies and wreckage are brought in by boat. Dr. Cumin Doyle is a pathologist at the Cork Regional Hospital.
The first bodies arrived at 4:45 p.m. on that Sunday afternoon, and at 12 midnight we had 130 bodies.
Doyle and his team will examine the bodies to see if they can find any signs of what caused the crash.
It's an enormous undertaking for everybody involved, the hospital personnel, the police, the Navy, the Army, and pathologists like ourselves, but we just had to get on and do the job.
There are so many autopsies to perform that Doyle moves the work into the building's gym.
We had 3 police people working on each body, photographer, a ballistics expert, and a forensic odontologist. That is a person who examines the teeth, the face, for identification purposes.
In just 4 days, autopsies are performed on 132 victims.
All parts of the body were examined externally in detail, and every detail was noted down. We were looking, of course, for the causes of the fatalities.
Doyle makes a telling discovery. Almost all the victims died in the air.
Only 2 of the bodies showed signs of drowning, which indicated that the others were not breathing when they hit the water.
There's something else that's common to many of the victims. A large number have had their clothes torn off.
Now that was important, because if they had no clothes or little clothes, it indicated that they had fallen from 31,000 feet or so where this accident occurred.
Some of the bodies also have signs of so-called flail injuries. These are breaks specific to bones in the hips, shoulders, and other joints. H.S. Kohler is the lead investigator into the Air India disaster. The flail injuries tell him the passengers weren't in the plane when it hit the ocean.
They are caused by tumbling, violent motion of the body in air. And that is the pattern of the injuries when a passenger is thrown out of the aircraft at a high altitude.
The autopsies show that somehow the plane had been ripped apart high above the water. Passengers were thrown into the sky long before the plane crashed.
Based on the injuries, we could only say that the plane had broken up at 31,000 feet. We couldn't say what the cause of the breakup was.
The biggest challenge in this accident was that we had no physical evidence available to us in this accident in terms of wreckage, in terms of passengers, crew, or in terms of eyewitnesses. In this accident, we had nothing.
The most important job of the investigators is to try to find the plane's black boxes. The 2 devices record cockpit conversation and other technical information about the flight of the plane. The recorders have radio beacons which send out a signal at a designated frequency. But it's still a huge task. The boxes are more than 6,500 feet below the surface, and the radio signals last just 30 days. Salim Jiwa is a journalist who has investigated the Air India disaster.
The search for the black boxes was urgent, and 3 countries participated in it: England, Ireland, and India.
But even with such a massive response, early efforts are frustrated.
42 kilohertz. It's too high. It can't be them.
Investigators are picking up radio signals, but they're at the wrong frequency. As the search continues, H.S. Kohler and his team study the maintenance history of the plane. They want to know if an undetected flaw had caused the jet to come apart in flight. They uncover a potentially important piece of information. The Air India jet was flying with 5 engines. A 747 normally has 4 engines, but it can carry more. The plane was designed so that it could transport a malfunctioning engine beneath its wings. Ground crews can mount the engine to a bracket on the plane. It's exactly what happened to the Air India jet.
There was an extra engine that a previous flight had left behind that was mounted on the wing of the aircraft.
The extra engine creates substantial drag on the left side of the plane. If the pilots don't properly compensate, the plane will start turning in that direction.
And this hypothesis continued that there is possibility that this fifth engine might have caused the breakup of the wing.
In fact, investigators discover that before the plane took off for London, the flight engineer noticed problems with the way the engine was attached.
There was a small problem in the fifth engine. I've asked them to fix it up.
All right.
Investigators also learned that some internal parts of the extra engine were taken out and stored in Flight 182's cargo bay. They are so enormous that pieces of the cargo door were removed to make the job easier.
Some of the other parts of the engine went into the rear of the aircraft. Aircraft such as the 747 can handle this quite easily, it's routinely done.
But if the cargo door wasn't reassembled properly, it could have led to an explosive decompression. In 1974, a cargo door blew off a Turkish Airlines flight shortly after it took off from Paris. The sudden decompression crippled the plane. It crashed moments later, killing everyone on board. Kohler must consider two theories. Either problems with the door or with the extra engine itself brought down the plane. If either one had taken place, there should be evidence on the plane's black boxes. Finding the recorders has become increasingly important. Almost 2 weeks after the search begins, investigators get news that helps them pinpoint the location of the black boxes.
The signal will be higher. So this 42 kilohertz could be it. Tell the boats to look again.
The piece of the black box which broadcasts the locator signal is made of ceramic. If it's damaged, the frequency of the signal can change. It means the strange frequency ships detected earlier could be the right one. Both the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder are finally located. But they're so deep, it's difficult to bring them up.
The aircraft was at 6,000 feet below the sea, and it was the depth that was sort of defeating.
A deep-sea submersible is brought in. But even with this specialized vehicle and with the location of the black boxes known, it takes 4 attempts to bring the recorders to the surface.
Estimate FIR at 0735.
Air India 182, Shannon, roger. Cleared for London.
Lead investigator Kohler now has what he hopes are 2 vital pieces of the puzzle.
If there's any problem in the aircraft, the crew will be talking about the problem. They will not be silent about the problem.
But when he listens to the cockpit voice recorder, Kohler hears nothing unusual. After the last contact with air traffic control in Shannon, the voice recorder picks up the crew talking about customs seals.
To seal the bar before the
It's
arrival.
paperwork that has to be completed before landing.
Have not been used. And they want about 30 custom seals.
Customs?
Yeah, custom seals to seal the bar before its arrival.
The conversation ends in mid-sentence.
That was it, and then everything was, of course, silent.
The cockpit voice recorder indicated that there was no abnormality in the cockpit, no emergency. Every conversation was normal.
The plane's flight data recorder tells a similar story. Kohler pours through details about Air India's speed, altitude, and dozens of other pieces of information. The extra engine did cause the plane to bank slightly, and the jet's rudder was turned 11 degrees to the right. But this was exactly what the crew needed to do to offset the drag created by the fifth engine.
We found that all parameters of the aircraft altitude, aircraft heading, aircraft bank attitude, roll attitude, autopilot engage, everything was working normally till the last point.
After analyzing both black boxes, Kohler can't find any evidence that the plane was in trouble before it suddenly disappeared from radar. But the very lack of evidence does suggest something. Both recorders get their power from the plane's engines. Both stopped at exactly 14 minutes and 1 second after 8 in the morning. Since the recorders stopped working at the same time, the problem on the plane had to be catastrophic enough to sever the jet's electronic system before the crew could react.
Yeah, custom seals to seal the bar before its arrival.
Investigators are becoming convinced that there are only two possible explanations for the crash: a devastating decompression or a bomb. They study the wreckage that's been found floating on the surface of the ocean, but it's just a small percentage of the entire plane. And none of it is helpful to investigators. It offers no clues to explain why the plane crashed.
We knew there was no fire. We knew the aircraft was performing well. Everything was normal. There was no cockpit emergency, no warning. We got elimination of all the things, but we did not got the answer as what happened. To go to the cause of the accident, we had to go to the wreckage which was lying at the bottom of the sea.
But what parts of the plane should investigators focus on? The black boxes were equipped with radio transmitters which made them easier to find. But the debris field is deep underwater and enormous, some 16 kilometers long and 6 kilometers across. How do investigators identify the one clue that will help them unlock the mystery? Roy Truman is an underwater salvage expert. He's brought in to do something that's never been done before: retrieve the ruined pieces of a jumbo jet from the bottom of the ocean. In hundreds of thousands of pieces, he needs to find the ones that will explain why the plane crashed.
Up until that time, we had only been used with recovering small aircraft. Here we're talking about a 747, which was huge, and we had no idea of the size of the pieces and what we were going to find.
Investigators know they can't bring the entire wreck to the surface. It's so deep it takes hours to recover a single piece. The submersible takes underwater video and still photos. Investigators use those to decide which pieces to bring to the surface.
It was a narrow corridor, and at each end of the corridor, it was very light wreckage. All of the heavy stuff, engines, main aircraft structure was in the middle of the wreckage field.
Like searching for a needle in an underwater haystack, investigators hope to discover the cause of the crash in a tangle of ruined metal. But autumn is coming. Soon the weather will turn bad, and they'll have to abandon their search. The key to unlocking the disaster still lies somewhere at the bottom of the ocean. Investigators from India are scouring the ocean floor, trying to find out why Air India Flight 182 fell from the sky. As the work continues in Ireland, there's growing suspicion in Canada that the Air India crash was no accident. As police and investigators sift through the list of passengers on the plane, they find something peculiar. Many of the passengers who were on Air India Flight 182 began their day in Vancouver. They were using another plane to connect to Flight 182. One of the passengers who bought a ticket for that plane never got on.
Well, the passenger, we have never identified him per se, but the ticket identified him as M. Singh. It simply had an initial, but no full name. We believe that name to be was fictitious, and that the person never intended to travel.
While he never boarded the plane, M. Singh did check in.
Next, please. On your way to Toronto?
And I want my bag checked through to Delhi.
Sir, I can't do that. Your reservation is only confirmed to Toronto.
Oh, I am confirmed. This is my ticket.
Jeannie Adams is a ticket agent working for
You are
Canadian
on standby
Pacific.
to Delhi. I can't. Mr. Singh, you are on standby to Delhi. I can't.
But then I have to pick up my bag.
I can't check your bags through to India if you are not confirmed.
But I am indeed confirmed. Wait, I'll get my brother. He'll tell you.
There are as many as 30 people waiting to check
Do
in.
that, sir. Your reservation is only confirmed.
Adams doesn't have time to wait for the man's brother.
Oh, okay. I'll check it through. But you have to check with Air India when you get to Toronto. Your seat is 10D.
Even though Singh doesn't have a ticket taking him to India, his bag is checked straight through. His luggage is loaded, but no one notices that Singh never boards the plane that leaves Vancouver.
She broke the rules as they were. She should not have allowed that to go through for New Delhi Interline. But she was so bullied and so browbeaten by Mr. Singh in front of everybody else that I think to her eternal sadness and heartbreak, she gave in.
Singh's maroon bag didn't raise any concerns when it was loaded in Vancouver. Since the Air India flight was international, when the bag arrived in Toronto, it faced a more strict series of inspections.
This is what it will sound like.
John D'Souza is a security officer for Air India. The day of the flight, he demonstrated a portable explosives detector for baggage handlers in Toronto. Chemicals in a match triggered the device, as would chemicals used in some explosives.
Okay.
The portable device was put to use because the X-ray machine, which normally scans every piece of luggage, had broken down.
The technology, especially the X-ray technology, were very weak, very in their infancy at that time, and it didn't work reliably. And in the case of the Air India episode, the technology went quite badly wrong, which was one of the tragedies of this situation.
As security workers used the portable explosives wand on the bags, everything seemed normal, until they got to the maroon bag. The bag did trigger the device, but the sound it made was very different from the one workers heard during the demonstration. The bag was passed and allowed on board the plane, eventually flying towards England. Air India Flight 182 flies over the Atlantic Ocean carrying M. Singh's bag. An explosion rips through Tokyo's Narita Airport. 2 baggage handlers are killed. 4 people are injured. A bomb has been hidden inside another piece of luggage that came from Vancouver. Luggage that was bound for another Air India jet.
And it was headed for the cargo hold. When it exploded on the ground, once it was put on, the bag was probably just thumped a little bit, and it exploded as the 2 Japanese baggage handlers were putting it on a conveyor belt.
Just as on Flight 182, one of the bags being moved in Tokyo was checked in by a passenger who never boarded the flight.
There was no X-ray machines in use at Vancouver Airport. There was nothing to stop that bag from flying to Tokyo.
There's a disturbing connection between the Tokyo bombing and the Air India flight. The tickets for the men who checked both bags were bought on the same day by the same customer. The single crash of Air India Flight 182 has suddenly become part of a much larger story. With the apparent connection between the two incidents, investigators in Ireland are extremely interested in what police find in Tokyo. Soon after the bombing, forensic experts descend on Japan's Narita airport. There are traces of evidence everywhere.
The Narita bombing was within a confined space. So unlike the Air India Flight 182 situation where we had debris scattered over 9 miles under the ocean and pretty hard to retrieve, we had, in a sense, the good fortune of a contained area where an explosive device went off.
Pieces of metal and circuit boards are embedded in the walls. Explosive residue clings to parts of the container that housed the bomb.
Amazingly, Japanese forensic experts were able to pick out tiny parts and fragments, and all the analysis finally led Japanese police to identify the vehicle that was used to carry the bomb.
Experts even find serial numbers on pieces of the wreckage. Clues that show the bomb was hidden inside a specific stereo tuner made by Sanyo. All 2,000 tuners that were ever made were shipped to a warehouse near Vancouver, British Columbia. From there, they were sent to stores across the region. One of those tuners carried the bomb that exploded at Narita. Police have a difficult task trying to trace the sale of 2,000 tuners. They could have been sold to anyone. Most of the stores that had received the tuner had been sold out for years. But police get a break when they ask about the tuner at a store in Duncan, a tiny town on Vancouver Island. The last unit had been sold just a few weeks ago.
They were able to figure out who bought the stereo tuner which contained the bomb.
Police obtained the same sort of tuner that was used to house the bomb on Air India. They conduct tests to see how big the bomb would have to be to create the sort of damage that was found in Tokyo.
There was a progressive experimentation using dynamite to find out the extent of damage particular strands of dynamite would cause.
They match the size of the tuner fragments made after each explosion with the fragments that were found at Narita. They discover that just a few sticks of dynamite were likely used in the Tokyo bomb. But could just 4 sticks of dynamite really bring down a jet? Once they discover just how powerful the Narita bomb was, police place it into a fully loaded luggage container. The devastation is enormous.
Any decompression caused by an event, an explosive device in the luggage hole, would be sufficient to cause catastrophic results for that aircraft. You don't need much. 4 sticks of dynamite can do the job.
The cramped quarters of a cargo hold amplify the power of a bomb. Tests conducted at Penn State University show that the shockwaves created from a bomb blast don't travel in just one direction, but reverberate inside a luggage container, building on each other, vastly increasing the initial force of the explosion. If a bomb had indeed exploded in the cargo hold of Air India, it would have caused enormous amounts of destruction. It's the sort of damage that should have left its mark on the remains of Flight 182. Investigators have a growing suspicion that this plane was brought down by a bomb, but they still have no proof.
So the investigators were not only looking for something that was broken that might have caused the failure, but they were looking for signs of what caused the explosion, such as burning or solvent stains or possibly shrapnel in seats. It meant a lot tighter scrutiny of every piece of wreckage.
We kept on analyzing each photograph. Is it giving any indication of an explosion? Is it giving any impact damage?
Knowing his time is running out, Kola selects a few key pieces of the plane to bring to the surface. Bad weather forces him to leave the rest behind. Kola hopes the bits he does have can prove there was a bomb on board. Each piece that's brought up is carefully mapped to its original position on the jet. One of the most promising sections brought up from the bottom is the floor of the front cargo bay.
When we recovered that item, we found that it had holes which are of a very special nature. Penetration from inside to outside at a very high speed. Curling of the edges of that one. And that was indicative of that perhaps this is the place where the explosion had occurred.
As many as 20 holes are found. In each, the metal is bent outward, like the petals of a flower. These are classic signs of something being blown out from the cargo bay. On the side wall of the cargo bay, investigators find more clues. Additional holes are discovered, like the ones on the floor. These also appear to have been blown out from the cargo hold. A closer study of the ceiling of the cargo bay also indicates that the ribs connecting it to the fuselage were broken by being forced up. Investigators are convinced that the wreckage shows that a bomb had exploded in the forward cargo hold. If the bomb had gone off in the front of the plane, it would explain why the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder cut off so quickly. Like other 747s, the electronics bay on the Air India flight is located below the cockpit. Many of the important electrical systems on the plane run through here. The forward luggage compartment is right beside it.
And so when the bomb went off, the explosion would have taken out the computers completely, and there would have been absolutely dead silence, and that's precisely what happened.
Investigators are convinced that Air India Flight 182 has been destroyed by a bomb. This was no accident. The crash of the passenger jet was a crime.
Nobody thought that such an evil plot of blowing two aircraft simultaneously would occur from Vancouver.
Exhaustive detective work creates a clear picture of what likely happened on board the Air India jet. In Toronto, M. Singh's bag is taken off the Vancouver flight and moved onto the Air India jet. It's put into a luggage container that's eventually placed at the front of the jet, right behind the plane's electronics bay. As the plane sailed over the Atlantic Ocean, the crew had no warning that a bomb was ticking down to disaster.
They want about 30 custom seals.
Customs?
Yeah, custom seals to seal the bar before its arrival.
When the force of the blast hit the floor of the jet, it pushed it violently upwards. The thin fuselage would have been blown apart. The air pressure inside the plane would have rushed out, tearing passengers from the cabin and fatally crippling the jet.
The debris scattered over 9 miles is an indication of how rapidly and how how fearsome this whole decompression was. But in this instance, the aircraft completely didn't stand a chance of flight. There was no way of continuing flight in this case.
As the jet fell towards the sea, the forces put on the fuselage tore it apart.
It would have a tail torn off and the wings would start breaking. And there's no way of sustaining flight after that. It goes into gyrations. Once it goes into gyrations, there was just massive structural failure.
After months of painstaking work, investigators believe they have unraveled the cause of the Air India crash. They've proven a bomb brought the plane down. It's now up to police to find the bombers. But with so many deaths, and so many more possible if the Narita bomb had exploded in mid-air, there's immediate interest in making passenger jets safer.
This was one of the biggest disasters in the Indian aviation history. And it could have been avoided if the procedures were in place.
As the hunt for the killers continues, extraordinary steps are taken to tighten security and to see if jets can be made to withstand the force of a bomb. It's May 1997. More than 10 years after a terrorist bomb destroyed Air India Flight 182. An out-of-service 747 is about to take part in a remarkable test. 2 bombs are placed in the front cargo bay. 2 more are put in the back.
Well, the Burning-Thorpe test was actually intended to prove 5 years worth of research, that we can protect an airplane using hardened luggage containers or hardened liners in the cargo hold.
The plane is also pressurized to simulate the conditions a jet would encounter at cruising altitude.
Pressurization is the key to that kind of experiment. The added energy that you have from the pressurization inside the airplane adds to the damage. You can think of it as a balloon. If you take a pin and you put it in a balloon that's uninflated, you get just a simple hole the size of the pin. However, if you blow that balloon up and you hit it with a pin, it pops catastrophically.
When the bombs are detonated, the result is devastating.
The force of the blast plus the pressure inside the jet just tore the plane apart. And that's the closest we can come to seeing what would have happened to a jet in flight.
The destructive power of bombs on jets is well known. But what the tests at Bruntingthorpe showed was that relatively simple measures can substantially minimize the damage caused by an explosion. One of the bombs in the rear cargo hold was placed in a normal luggage container. But the bombs in the front cargo hold were different. One was placed in a specialized container strengthened with a material similar to that found in bulletproof vests. The other was put in a normal container, but placed beside walls that had been reinforced with a blast-absorbing liner. When the bombs explode, the front of the plane is virtually untouched.
We had no breach of the airplane skin with the liner or with the hardened luggage containers. But towards the rear of the airplane or the tail, where we didn't have any of the hardened materials, it was a catastrophic failure for the airplane.
The standard luggage container did nothing to minimize the blast. Both the protective lining in the front cargo bay and the hardened luggage container were able to absorb the force of the explosion.
It's only speculation, but would steps like these have saved Air India? Very likely. Would they make the industry safer today? Absolutely.
Despite the dramatic results of the tests in Britain, hardened luggage containers are not used by world's airlines. While effective at stopping bombs, they're extremely expensive.
The hardened containers are not in use now because it's just not economically feasible. The containers cost the tens of thousands of dollars just to purchase, and they're very fragile. They're composite materials, so if you run into the side of them with a forklift, they're pretty much useless from that point forward.
There have been significant improvements made to the way that passenger luggage is screened at most international airports. More sophisticated color X-ray systems using multiple scanning beams are now used.
But I am indeed confirmed. Wait, I'll get my brother. He'll tell you.
Oh, okay. I'll check it through. But you have to check with Air India when you get to Toronto.
And there are stricter regulations about luggage getting sent forward on connecting flights.
In the case of Air India, the most important thing of all was passenger baggage reconciliation. This is the key to detecting an explosive device or a terrorist. No plane leaves with baggage unattached to a specific passenger inside that plane. And that must be so.
Your seat is 10B.
I think one of the most difficult piece of news for the families to accept was the many ways in which this tragedy could have been prevented. I mean, it was absolutely unforgivable that a bag could be interlined to another destination without a passenger accompanying it.
The quality of training that security guards at airports get also came under scrutiny during the years after the Air India crash. It's still an area of concern for some security experts.
There's a real failure to train security personnel. And that failure is because you cannot pay rent-a-cops subsistent wages to look after your security when you get on board an aircraft.
In the Air India case, police eventually traced the bombing to Sikh extremists living in Canada. They're fighting to have an independent Sikh homeland created in India. The man who confessed to assembling the bomb is sent to prison. The man suspected of masterminding the plot is killed several years later while under arrest in India. Both men had deep ties to Canada's West Coast Sikh community. It's a connection that still bothers Lata Pada.
It was a deliberate act of terrorism, and hurts even more that they were executed by Canadians on Canadian soil against Canadians.
More than 20 years after the destruction of the Air India flight, the shock of the day is still fresh. And many questions remain unanswered.
We still don't know who the two people were who checked in the bags. Apart from the basics of who made the bomb, we don't know much about who else assisted them. We don't know who picked up those tickets. There's a vow of silence that has hindered the investigation.
This inquiry will be launched immediately.
In 2006, the Canadian government launched an inquiry into the Air India bombing, another investigation of what happened and why. The shocking death of so many is a continuing source of anger and disbelief. No matter what the inquiry finds, the sobering facts are the same. 329 people killed in an instant. There are memorials now in Ireland and Canada, mourning the victims of the Air India crash. Marking the day a terrorist bomb ripped through the lives of so many.
It's just so tragic about all our lives that we lead. Every day is an ordinary day in our lives, but some days, unexpectedly, something completely, totally unexpected shatters your life, and that was one of those moments.